Post-Capitalist Desire, The Final Lectures by Mark Fisher, with an introduction by Matt Cahoon. Introduction. No More Miserable Monday Mornings by Matt Cahoon. Atrocity Exhibition. In the introduction to his unfinished book, Acid Communism, the late Mark Fisher, famous for his love of post-punk, jungle, and a range of contemporary pop experimentalists, surprised friends and fans alike by writing positively about the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s. Fisher had previously been scathing about the legacy of the counterculture. He had once declared on his K-punk blog, for instance, that hippie was fundamentally a middle-class male phenomenon, defined by a hedonic infantilism. For him, the hippie's characteristic sloppiness, ill-fitting clothes, unkempt appearance, and fuzzed-out psychedelic fascist drug talk displayed a disdain for sensuality. For Mark Fisher, there was no greater crime. The hippies, as if trapped in an invasion of the body snatchers type scenario of their own devising, were guilty of passively and mindlessly giving in to the pleasure principle, and the price of such happiness, a state of cored-out, cheery pod people affectlessness, was the sacrifice of all autonomy. As far as Fisher was concerned, to self-induce a stoned stupor, chemically or otherwise, was to do capitalism's work for it, as if driven by a Freudian repetition compulsion to artificially implement capitalism's cognitive capture from within, demonstrating the human organism's marked tendency to seek out and identify itself with parasites that debilitate but never quite destroy it. Instead, on his K-punk blog in particular, Fisher offered another path. This path did not require the superficial primitivism of showering less and smoking more, nor was it akin to a New Age over-reliance on positive but hollow affirmations. If we are to take our psychedelic dream of emancipation seriously, and if it is to have any contemporary relevance whatsoever, we have to realize that nothing can be achieved by getting off your head on drugs. This was not a moral point, however, but an acutely political one. The point was, instead, to get out through your head, through the application of a psychedelic reason, auto-affecting your brain into a state of ecstasy. Fisher furnished his alternative with the 17th century philosophy of Baruch Spinoza, where this psychedelic reason lies in wait, ready to be uncovered. Spinoza is the prince of philosophers, really the only one you need, he writes. Before Deleuze and Guattari, Freud and Lacan, it was Spinoza who held the key to exorcising that parasitic demon of modernity, the capitalist ego, from one's mind. He notes that Spinoza took for granted what would later become the first principle of Marx's thought, that it was more important to change the world than to interpret it. Spinoza attempted to do this by constructing a reflexive ethical project that was effectively psychoanalysis 300 years early. Fisher continues, vernacular psychology has it that emotions are irreducibly mysterious, too fuzzy and indistinct to analyze beyond a certain point. Spinoza, on the other hand, maintains that happiness is a matter of emotional engineering, a precise science which can be learned and practiced. In tune with popular wisdom, Spinoza is clear that what brings well-being to one entity will be poison to another. The first and foremost overriding drive of any entity, Spinoza says, is its will to persist in its own being. When an entity starts to act against its own best interests to destroy itself, as sadly Spinoza observes humans are wont to do, it has been taken over by external forces. To be free and happy entails exorcising these invaders and acting in accordance with reason. In this sense, Fisher's blogospheric rallying cry was to argue that we already possess everything that we need to escape the confines of capitalist realism. That ideological straitjacket that keeps us compliant and unimaginative. The external invader constricting our minds, bodies, and the self-realization of our being today. Drugs like acid or ecstasy might loosen up the mind to a certain degree, but they neglect the other, more lucidly existential parts of human subjectivity. Our capacity to reason, our political agency, leaving them to rot and atrophy. In this sense, the problem with drugs, Fisher argues, is that they are like an escape kit without an instruction manual. Taking MDMA is like improving Microsoft Windows. No matter how much tinkering Bill Gates does, MS Windows will always be shit because it is built on top of the rickety structure of DOS. The drugs, then, are all too temporary. Using ecstasy will always fuck up in the end because the human OS, operating system, has not been taken out and dismantled. As fun as they may be, in the grand scheme of things, and as the old song goes, the drugs don't work, they just make things worse. However, when the hippies rose from their supine hedon haze to assume power, Fisher continues, addressing the aesthetic ubiquity and cultural power of the counterculture that has lingered long past the movement's political usefulness, they brought their contempt for sensuality with them. Culturally speaking, the shadow of this moment is long. With the new sensuality of post-punk eventually defeated, Fisher connects the virulence of this anti-sensual sensibility to the cultural yuppies of the 1990s, epitomized by the young British artists alongside the adjacent rise to power of Britpop's laddishness. It is hard to deny the prevalence of the counterculture's negative trajectory when framed in this way. Whilst at first it seems like there is little more than a similar predilection for round T-shade sunglasses, connecting the Beatles' John Lennon to Oasis's Liam Gallagher, for instance, in fact, the counterculture's cul-de-sac of passivity, or as Fisher puts it, its "hey man, it's all about the mind" sensibility, was as much the driving force behind the bleary, blurry, beery, leery, leery vibe of Britpop hedonism as it was for the acid tests of the bohemian unwashed. This is apparent as soon as we cast an eye over the acid mundanity captured in two songs. The Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, 1967, and Oasis's Champagne Supernova, 1995. 30 years apart, from two politically distinct worlds. The bond of a psychedelic melancholia nonetheless binds them together. The same hauntological and melancholic transference can be seen in John Lennon and Yoko Ono's 1969 performative sit-in, Bed-Ins for Peace, the rotten husk of which re-emerged from the funereal white cube of the Tate Gallery in the form of Tracey Emin's 1998 work, My Bed. This superficial regurgitation of 60s concerns under the melancholy of 90s capitalism resembles the fin de siècle decadence of the previous century, a nightmarish and fumbling autopsy of a long-dead dream, albeit devoid of any of its proto-modernist self-awareness. Britpop, in this sense, was truly an atrocity exhibition, curating a fashion show procession of neoliberal spectres and zombies, now haunting and stalking the psyche. The abstract ecstasy of psychedelic reason. It is fair to say that nothing from this period of Fisher's blogging days, a particularly productive August in 2004, constitutes, putting it lightly. His critiques are barbed and often wholly negative. So how did this Mark Fisher transform into the Fisher of acid communism? Despite this unflattering appraisal from the mid-2000s, it seemed that Fisher later softened his opinion on the counterculture as a whole. And yet, despite appearances, this transformation was not so extreme. Fisher instead took it upon himself to move beyond his barbed critiques and work towards the construction of a positive political project, a project that still had his Spinozist psychedelic reason at its heart. It seems that in the process of constructing such a project, Fisher had begun to newly appreciate the political potentials of the counterculture's best cultural and aesthetic offerings, at least in their original socio-political context. These potentials were not to be found in the surrealist abstractions of a bourgeois Pink Floyd concert, repurposed nostalgically and apolitically for today. Instead, they were to be found explicitly in the cultural artifacts that build new bridges between class consciousness and psychedelic consciousness, between class consciousness and group consciousness, but which were smothered or abandoned before their time. For instance, in the introduction to Acid Communism, Fisher champions the Kinks' Sunny Afternoon and the Beatles' I'm Only Sleeping as two tracks, both released in 1966, that were able to apprehend the anxiety-dream toil of everyday life from a perspective that floated alongside, above or beyond it. Whether it was the busy street glimpsed from the high window of a late sleeper, whose bed becomes a gently idling rowing boat, the fog and frost of a Monday morning abjured from a sunny Sunday afternoon that does not need to end, or the urgencies of business airily disdained from the eyrie of a meandering aristocratic pile, now occupied by working-class dreamers who will never clock on again. There was more to this political provocation than the average BBC Radio 4 listener's dream of a quiet Sunday that never ends. More generally, Fisher was interested, and had always been interested, in the ways that radical political messages could be smuggled into collective consciousness through popular culture. He was also intrigued by the ways that pop culture could not only entice us with its infectious euphoria, but also push past capitalism's co-option of the pleasure principle into something deeper, something altogether unconscious, and bring it kicking and screaming to the surface. A number of questions nonetheless remain. Most importantly, Marx sought to ask where these potentials went and why. It was obvious that, as he would later put it, the establishment feared nothing more than the working class becoming hippies. But why was this? What was it in the counterculture that threatened the establishment so much that a burgeoning neoliberal order saw it as necessary to implement a hostile takeover of a new collective consciousness? And might the renewed manifestation of some of these thwarted potentials still threaten the capitalist realist establishment today? These questions constitute a view of psychedelia that still needs to be affirmed. It is the dormant function of psychedelia in this sense, rather than its familiar aesthetic form, that remains relevant to us in the present moment. The way the word itself, all aesthetic associations aside, connotes the manifestation of what is deep within the mind, not simply on its surface. An irregular conjunction of the modern English prefix psyche and the more blatant Greek root deilos, meaning manifest or reveal. The psychedelic is that which manifests what is in the mind, echoing Marx's Spinozist adage once again, that we must not settle for interpreting the world, but instead strive to change it. This is not to set interpretation and manifestation in opposition, however. Rather, the former must always strive to become the latter. A new psychedelic culture is required, then, that will inform politics anew, but it may not look like we expect it to. Indeed, we should be vigilant against anything that appears too familiar. We might even argue that the aesthetic connotations of psychedelia today are to be rejected outright. As Fisher once wrote on surrealism, one of countercultural psychedelia's clearest antecedents, like punk, surrealism is dead as soon as it is reduced to an aesthetic style. It comes unlive again when it is instantiated as a delirial program, just as punk comes unlive when it is effectuated as an anti-authoritarian, acephalic contagion network. This is why the counterculture should be handled with care. In spite of, or perhaps because of, its contemporary romanticization, it seems to have been the last time that a cultural revolution came close to effectuating a political one. Culture has nonetheless continued to develop apace, but politics has been sluggish to catch up. Nevertheless, there is still a great deal to be excited about, despite the state of the contemporary political establishment. As Fisher concludes in the introduction to Acid Communism, of course, we know that the revolution did not happen, but the material conditions for such a revolution are more in place in the 21st century than they were in 1977. Rather than simply celebrating the potentials of the counterculture, Fisher had serious questions to ask about why it failed, and how we might learn from those lessons today. He continues, "What has shifted beyond all recognition since then is the existential and emotional atmosphere. Populations are resigned to the sadness of work, even as they are told that automation is making their jobs disappear. We must regain the optimism of that 70s moment, just as we must carefully analyze all the machineries that capital deployed to convert confidence into dejection. Understanding how this process of consciousness deflation worked is the first step to reversing it." The essay ends on a cliffhanger, and this call to understand the process fades away, seemingly without a roadmap. Following Fisher's death in January 2017, the assumption has been that the particulars of Acid Communism were lost with their author, and yet there remain plenty of breadcrumbs out in the world for the curious reader to consider. Perhaps the best thing to do is apply Fisher's advertised strategy to his own thinking. Understanding how the project of Acid Communism emerged is the first step to reconstructing it. Such a strategy requires a lot less speculation than one might first assume. Along with a disparate collection of essays, spanning the length of his career as a writer and critic, that reflect many of the themes and subjects he was expected to explore, there is also the structure of Fisher's final postgraduate lecture series, Post-Capitalist Desire, which he devised for the academic year of 2016-17 at Goldsmiths, University of London. New Year, New You. The dawn of the academic year 2016-17 brought about a number of changes to the Visual Cultures department at Goldsmiths. This was true for everyone, but particularly Mark Fisher and Kojo Eshin. Prior to that year, the pair had co-convened a postgraduate Master of Arts degree in Oral and Visual Cultures, a course which, in short, asked the question, how do we think about the relation of sound and image in the era of ubiquitous media? However, following a number of administrative changes within the university, this course, along with a handful of other relatively small master's courses, was to be subsumed into a pre-existing and now conglomerated MA course in contemporary art theory. These changes could have been taken as a loss for Fisher and Eshin, but they instead took the opportunity to try something new, leaving behind the focus of oral and visual cultures to develop two separate modules that reflected their present interests. Whilst Eshin devised the Geopoetics Seminar, a 15-week very close reading of Reza Negarestani's notoriously difficult 2008 work of theory fiction, Cyclonopedia, Fisher began Post-Capitalist Desire, a seminar in which he would explore the nefarious and entangled relationship between desire and capitalism, and the extent to which the former can both help and restrict us in our attempts to escape from the latter. It could also be seen as an attempt to workshop his next book, the now familiar work in progress, given the tentative title of Acid Communism. The course took its name from an essay Fisher had previously published in 2012, exploring the relation of desire to politics in a post-Fordist context. Taking seriously a much ridiculed comment made by Conservative politician Louise Mensch on British television about the apparent hypocrisy of Occupy protesters in 2010, protesters who decried capitalism whilst standing in line at Starbucks tweeting about politics from their iPhones, Fisher argued that Mensch's position nonetheless warrants a serious response. This was to suggest that whilst Mensch's cynicism was superficial, the implications of her critique remained deeply troubling. To what extent is our desire for post-capitalism always already captured and neutralized by capitalism itself? How are we supposed to combat the intensification of desire for consumer goods funded by credit? Should we even try? For Fisher, the response to this problem cannot be, as Mensch suggests, a reactionary striving for a pre-capitalist primitivism. The libidinal attractions of consumer capitalism, he suggests, need to be met with a counter-libidio, not simply an anti-libidinal dampening. Fisher goes on to demonstrate this need through a close engagement with the anti-Marxist writings of his controversial former lecturer, Nick Land, in particular Nick Land's essay, Machinic Desire. Here Land argues, in his quintessential 90s cyberpunk mode, for a kind of becoming replicant, a becoming immanent with the forces of capitalism. For Land, it is no longer plausible that the relation between capital and desire is either external or supported by immanent contradiction, even if a few comical ascetics continue to assert that libidinal involvement with the commodity can be transcended by critical reason. Here, capital is not an essence, but a tendency. Like the Lacanian death drive that asserts the innate nihilism of human existence to be a striving to return to the pre-Oedipal calm of the womb, Land argues that capitalism persists today because cyberspace is already under our skin, and to retreat from it is to retreat into some non-existent pre-capitalist imaginary. We have as much chance of escaping capitalism as we do of crawling back inside our mothers. As such, to attempt to separate our desires from capitalism is to stick a chest spreader in the still kicking subject of modernity. The application of reason to such an innately irrational endeavour isn't good enough. Despite Land's disavowal of application of reason placing their projects in apparent opposition to one another, and as nightmarish as the modern left more generally may find Land's appraisals, for Fisher the left would nonetheless be remiss to ignore them. The ways in which we can counter or ethically account for these critiques by implementing a counter-libido to capitalist desire, a post-capitalist desire, was to be the driving force behind Fisher's lecture series. For example, in the first lecture, he renewed this line of questioning, beginning once again with Mensch's provocation, whilst also addressing some of his personal responses, that is, some of his acid communism's, still unresolved tensions. However, before he and his students could look to a counter-libidinal future, just as he had forewarned his readers in the acid communism introduction, it was necessary that they first ascertained why any previous counter-libido had failed to effectuate and materialize real societal change. The first few lectures of the course attempted to answer these questions through a variety of readings, from the densely theoretical to the journalistic and pop historical. In the second lecture, for instance, addressing the perhaps surprising influence of Freudian psychoanalysis on the emerging counterculture, Fisher takes two contrasting views of the period. One from Frankfurt School philosopher Herbert Marcuse in 1955, the other from feminist essayist and music critic Ellen Willis in 1981. Taken together, they provide an insight into the period from a moment immediately prior to the counterculture's emergence, as well as a damning posthumous account of its eventual failure. It is an unnerving contrast. Marcuse's text remains as invigorating as it was over 60 years ago, but Willis's critiques also reverberate profoundly with our present. As Fisher wrote in a 2013 essay for eFlux, the 60s counterculture might now have been reduced to a series of iconic, over-familiar, endlessly circulated, dehistoricized aesthetic relics, stripped of political content, but Willis's work stands as a painful reminder of leftist failure. As Willis makes clear in her introduction to her 1981 book, Beginning to See the Light, she frequently found herself at odds with what she experienced as the authoritarianism and statism of mainstream socialism. While the music she listened to spoke of freedom, socialism seemed to be about centralization and state control. The story of how the counterculture was co-opted by the neoliberal right is now a familiar one. But the other side of this narrative is the left's incapacity to transform itself in the face of the new forms of desire to which the counterculture gave voice. This critique could also be found in other examples of Fisher's writings from around this time. 2013 was also the year that he published his now infamous essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle, for instance. What Willis had described from the dark side of the 1970s, Fisher saw continuing to undermine the hopes and dreams of the 21st century left. From the rift that emerged between the trade unions and the counterculture in America in the early 1970s, to British Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott's 1997 declaration that we're all middle class now, the latter half of the 20th century was defined, in Fisher's mind at least, by the disarticulation of class from almost all cultural and political discourses. In the 21st century, however, class was making a comeback. From the rise of grime to mainstream popularity in the early 2000s, to the publication of Owen Jones's 2011 book, Chavs, a new class consciousness was emerging in Britain, presenting itself in many different forms. Unfortunately, this class consciousness still struggled to perforate what Fisher had referred to as a febrile McCarthyite atmosphere fermented by the moralizing left. Fisher's tone in Exiting the Vampire Castle was one of fury and impatience, disappointment and frustration. It was, after all, an exit, but only from social media. The response to the essay, from some quarters at least, could make the more casual interlocutor think that Fisher had turned his back on all that the left held dear. It could be said that this was Fisher's critique from the other side also. In disarticulating class from the identitarian struggles of the day, capitalism no longer appeared to be the enemy. We were instead all too prone to impotently turning on one another. At the time, this critique of the political landscape seemed to be wholly negative, populated as it was by a vampiric cast of energy-sucking trolls who used social media, and Twitter especially, to wholly deflate any emerging political group consciousness. Echoing the various descriptions of grey vampires that had peppered his K-Punk blog, comment box marauders who don't feed on energy directly, they feed on obstructing projects, Fisher deplored the complacent, identitarian milieu of social media that seemed determined to undermine the most exciting pop cultural shift in decades. Although many rejected Fisher's appraisal outright, it was later vindicated in the years of the Brexit referendum and Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, with the latter in particular constituting a potential reformation of left-wing politics in Britain, one that was as consistently undermined from within as it was from without. The damage incurred by this political autoimmune disease in all its guises has been substantial to class consciousness above all else. Class consciousness is fragile and fleeting, Fisher argued, but the best way to combat this is to retain it as a topic of conversation. He continues, "The petty bourgeoisie which dominates the academy and the culture industry has all kinds of subtle deflections and preemptions which prevent the topic even coming up, and then, if it does come up, they make one think it is a terrible impertinence, a breach of etiquette to raise it. This indignation is as persistent as ever. However, the very fact that class consciousness must be persistently undermined gives us a sense of its nascent political power. Unfortunately, with Fisher's Vampire Castle going viral throughout the Anglosphere, igniting the social media outrage machine that he sought to critique, many wrote Fisher off entirely for committing the very cardinal sin he was hoping to call attention to, separating class consciousness from a consciousness of gender, race, or any other minoritarian category of self-identification. The reality of his position, as he would later take great care to emphasize, was quite the contrary. Consciousness raising. Fisher later refined the argument he had made so polemically in Exiting the Vampire Castle by transforming his negative critique into a positive project of consciousness raising. It was this same project that Fisher turned to in the third lecture of his Post-Capitalist Desire course. Becoming popular during the second-wave feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s, consciousness raising was the name given to a practice of collective discussion that highlighted the inequalities under which people collectively lived. This was a necessary process because, as Fisher argued in his Post-Capitalist Desire lectures, consciousness of one's material existence is, despite itself, not immediately self-evident. Instead, consciousness of one's place within a structure of inequality, be that capitalism, patriarchy, or white supremacy, must be constructed. It is never given. The best way to construct such a consciousness is with the participation of others who share a similar material existence. Writing for the political organization Plan C about the psychedelic potential still left to be extracted from a group practice like consciousness raising, Fisher explains, "To have one's consciousness raised is not merely to become aware of facts of which one was previously ignorant. It is, instead, to have one's whole relationship to the world shifted. The consciousness in question is not a consciousness of an already existing state of affairs. Rather, consciousness raising is productive. It creates a new subject, a we that is both the agent of struggle and what is struggled for. At the same time, consciousness raising intervenes in the object, the world itself, which is now no longer apprehended as some static opacity, the nature of which is already decided, but as something that can be transformed. This transformation requires knowledge. It will not come about through spontaneity, voluntarism, the experiencing of ruptural events, or by virtue of marginality alone. In the present, whilst there are agents of struggle everywhere, what is struggled for is disparate and unclear. It even seems to be the case that certain modes of political consciousness, seized by capitalism itself, have been used precisely to fragment solidarity rather than create it. As individuals squabble over who has the most privilege on Twitter, for instance, turning on each other, the true enemy, capitalism itself, is left completely off the hook. It was Fisher's hope that these newly raised and yet fragmented forms of consciousness, proliferating under so-called identity politics, could still find common ground that included a previously disarticulated class consciousness, a collective consciousness that builds an articulated awareness of minority struggles in order to better grasp the totality of the system at large, capitalism. This was necessary so that the left could produce what Fisher had once called, in his 2009 book Capitalist Realism, the required subject, a collective subject. Over the near decade that followed the publication of his surprise bestseller, Fisher would further develop this concept of a collective subjectivity, coming to prefer the term group consciousness. Returning to his essay for Plan C, It was here that Fisher most successively elaborated on the need to extend the idea of consciousness beyond the individual. He writes, "Since consciousness raising has been used by all kinds of subjugated groups, it would perhaps be better to talk now of subjugated group consciousness rather than just class consciousness. Subjugated group consciousness is first of all a consciousness of the cultural, political, existential machineries which produce subjugation. The machineries which normalize the dominant group and create a sense of inferiority in the subjugated. But secondly, it is also a consciousness of the potency of the subjugated group, a potency that depends upon this very raised state of consciousness. Unfortunately, in the years that followed the bruising reception of his exiting the vampire castle, this subjugated group consciousness kept on deflating. The Corbyn era of the Labour Party at first seemed to promise a revival, but the debacle of Brexit pricked any hope of this emerging consciousness coming to dominate. Whilst Fisher did not live to see the new lows to which Brexit would drag this consciousness, he nonetheless continued to highlight the incursions wrought upon it prior to that moment, in the hope that, just as Owen Jones had done in 2011, shining a light on the right example at the right time might just wake the nation from its neoliberal stupor. In 2014, for instance, Fisher turned to the controversial documentary series Benefit Street, which followed the lives of the residents of James Turner Street in Birmingham, a street that was supposedly home to more social welfare-dependent households than anywhere else in Britain. Writing for New Humanist magazine, Fisher argued that the programme, by its very nature, implied a default bourgeois gaze, which judges working-class participants as lacking by comparison with the middle class. Moreover, Fisher continues, this lack is understood in heavily moralized terms. It isn't to be explained by the working class's lack of resources or opportunities, but by a deficit in will and effort. In this sense, Benefit Street was a program that portrayed an even more pernicious mutation within the ever-evolving nature of capitalist realism. Not only was capitalism deemed by the realists to be the only game in town, but the gaze of its central phantasmatic subject, the evergreen middle class, was now taken to be the default subject position available as well. Whereas Fisher may have rejected the 90s announcement that we are all middle class now, our television screens continue to announce this reality silently, and without fanfare nonetheless. The message, though implicit, is familiar. There is no alternative. Hang on tight and spit on me. The enforcement of the middle class as a default subjective position would be skewered by Fisher in his final post-capitalist desire lecture before the Christmas break. Here, the fact that the working class might possibly find enjoyment in their own oppression becomes a challenge as darkly humorous as it is viscerally disenchanting. The challenges put forth by Fisher's former lecturer, Nick Land, echo ominously here once again. Reading aloud from Jean-François Lyotard's viciously difficult 1974 book, Libidinal Economy, Fisher relishes the work's most polemical passages, as Lyotard seems to prophesy the patronizing gaze cast upon James Turner Street, putting the producers on blast, who dare not say the only important thing there is to say, that one can enjoy swallowing the shit of capital. Its materials, its metal bars, its polystyrene, its books, its sausage pâtés, swallowing tons of it till you burst. As far as Lyotard is concerned, the English unemployed did not become workers to survive. They, hang on tight and spit on me, enjoyed the hysterical, masochistic, whatever exhaustion it was, of hanging on in the mines, in the foundries, in the factories, in hell. They enjoyed it, enjoyed the mad destruction of their organic body which was indeed imposed upon them. They enjoyed the decomposition of their personal identity, the identity that the peasant tradition had constructed for them, enjoyed the dissolution of their families and villages, and enjoyed the new monstrous anonymity of the suburbs and the pubs in the morning and evening. Fischer had long taken Lyotard's charge, in all its dark humour, deadly seriously. In his 2010 essay Terminator vs. Avatar, for instance, he updates Lyotard's provocation for the 21st century. Hands up who wants to give up their anonymous suburbs and pubs and return to the organic mud of the peasantry. Hands up, that is to say, all those who really want to return to pre-capitalist territorialities, families and villages. Hands up, furthermore, those who really believe that these desires for a restored organic wholeness are extrinsic to late capitalist culture, rather than in fully incorporated components of the capitalist libidinal infrastructure. The working class of the 21st century are as entangled in their subordinated desire for subordination, as they were in the 20th. But this apparent paradox of sadomasochistic desires is not without its uses. As Fischer continues, not far beneath Lyotard's desire-drunk yes lies the no of hatred, anger, and frustration. No satisfaction, no fun, no future. These are the resources of negativity that I believe the left must make contact with again. The left at large may not be ready for this at present, and Fischer himself may have softened his lust for negativity in the years to follow. But just as the developing counterculture repeatedly foreshadowed the political sea changes of the era, Lyotard's provocations find themselves encapsulated in much contemporary music and culture. Indeed, what is a counter-culture, if not a cultural hegemony, recast in negative? Whilst there are many examples to choose from in our present moment, this fire may find its most obvious spiritual successor in the Sleaford Mods, whose music oozes a fury in which economic and sexual frustration coalesce in a manner Lyotard first controversially put to work in his deeply transgressive theory of libidinal economy. On their 2008 track Job Seeker, for instance, vocalist Jason Williamson hangs on tight and spits on you through the speakers, rehearsing a kind of spiteful inner monologue. What he wishes he could say to the superficially sympathetic bureaucrats at the job centre. So, Mr. Williamson, what have you done to find gainful employment since your last signing-on date? Fuck all. I've been sat around the house wanking. And I want to know why you don't serve coffee here. My signing-on time is supposed to be 11:10. It's now 12 o'clock, and some of you smelly bastards need executing. Mr. Williamson, your employment history looks quite impressive. I'm looking at 3 managerial positions you previously held with quite reputable companies. Isn't this something you'd like to go back to? Nah, I just end up robbing the fucking place. You've got a till full of 20s staring at you all day. I'm hardly going to bank it. The job seeker rejects the moralized figure of the downtrodden and out of luck. It is the inverse of a figure like Daniel Blake, as seen in Ken Loach's critically acclaimed 2016 film, I, Daniel Blake. Rather than raising consciousness through sympathy, depicting through a fiction the abject reality of the British welfare state, Williamson instead raises consciousness through bloody-mindedness, bottling the shame of class subordination and weaponizing it. This is not to say the Sleaford Mods' rejection of a Ken Loach image is a rejection of that form of political consciousness. It simply offers up an inverse image of proletarian subjectivity, ejected from the system and loving it. Job Seeker reinvigorates Lyotard's desire-drunk yes, in this sense affirming the fact that this uneasy subjugation is what makes the working class a threat to the system itself. Fuck your middle-class propriety. I've got desires to pursue. Fischer's psychedelic reason still has a role to play here. The implication is that the stay-in-bed, float-upstream, anti-work ethic of the Beatles in the 60s is more within reach for today's working class than it has ever been before. What was good enough for John and Yoko is certainly good enough for the job seeker. Isn't it all the better the bed-in takes place in a flat in Grantham rather than a private suite at the Hilton Hotel? Reflecting on the present accessibility of this potent affectivity in a review of two Sleaford Mods releases for The Wire magazine in 2014, Fisher writes that the sort of discontent Williamson gives voice to is everywhere in the UK now, but for the most part it's privatised. Blunted by alcohol and antidepressants, or directed into impotent comment box spite and empty social media outrage. But it is nonetheless underscored by a class consciousness, painfully aware that there is nothing which could transform disaffection into political action. Many questions remain. Who will make contact with the anger and frustration that Williamson articulates? Who can convert this bad effect into a new political project? Who will seize this chemically blunted disaffection and let it loose on the establishment? This disaffection is, in a sense, only kindling to a wider movement. Is it doomed to impotence if the fire doesn't catch on the imagination of the demographic it gives voice to? Speaking about Lyotard with his students in late 2016, Fisher similarly admires the philosopher's glorious hemmed-in quality, but wonders if Lyotard's barbed rant is a display of the glorious kind of autonomy and sufficiency of the text itself, or its impotence or uselessness. These are the questions that continue to haunt culture today, and if they haunt culture, they will inevitably haunt politics. Unless the strengths of the latter emerge from the former, we may find ourselves stuck in the same negative feedback loop. Accelerate the process. Fisher's post-capitalist desire lectures, much like the introduction to his Acid Communism, present themselves as an attempt to root around this capture. They ask what is required of us if we truly want to push beyond capitalism. The suggestion that emerges from the fifth lecture of this series is that we must accelerate beyond the pleasure principle, beyond our culture of retrospection and pastiche, beyond the persistent disarticulation of group consciousness, beyond capitalist realism. In this sense, Fisher is attempting to describe to his students, from the ground up, a new praxis for a left accelerationism. Accelerationism is mentioned frequently throughout the lecture series. Fisher even goes so far as to claim the discourse surrounding the term to be probably the biggest influence on the course. But from the vantage point of 2020, its appearance warrants some further context. Accelerationism is much maligned today. Having garnered a perhaps fatal popular association with the far right, with the term most repulsively appearing in the 2019 manifesto of Australian white supremacist and mass murderer Brenton Tarrant, the popular understanding of this philosophy's aims today is that capitalism, or the status quo more generally, is some barely functioning, unsustainable mess of contradictions. Therefore, we should accelerate the mechanisms of capitalism, or the status quo, towards their inevitable doom. This position is even more loosely but frequently translated as things have to get worse before they can get better. However, as the philosopher Pete Wolfendale noted in 2015, this is not a position that anyone has ever held. In truth, the accelerationist position was a critique of the way that things are only getting worse. Crises, whether they be crises of capitalism or of protest, such as the financial crash of 2007-8 and the Occupy movement that followed it, no longer produce change. Negativity destroys the old, but no longer produces the new. It was with this in mind that accelerationism, a term coined by Benjamin Noyce in his 2010 critique of post-May 1968 continental philosophy, the persistence of the negative, was later seized upon by Mark Fisher and perversely affirmed. Noyce's book was, by and large, a critique of how continental philosophy was obsessed with affirming the negative. Fisher, in deftly trollish fashion, then affirmed Noyce's negative critique. In hindsight, this may have been a mistake on Fisher's part, but, for better or worse, the name stuck, straddling a bizarre confluence of competing positions. Fisher arguably usurped the term to demonstrate that Noyce's seemingly benevolent position, looking down on this entanglement of negations and affirmations, was a fallacy. Whereas Noyce attempted to untangle the mess, Fisher affirmed all sides, as if Noyce's project was itself a reification of the negative, extending the very problematic it hoped to critique. Fisher was nonetheless attuned to the ways that this negative feedback loop of affirmations and negations was the primary cause of the hauntological stuckness of the 21st century. Indeed, the online discourse surrounding accelerationism had emerged explicitly from the financial crash of 2007-8, following which the left and its protest movements seemed wholly incapable of effectuating real change. Whereas Noyce was concerned about the extent to which a philosophical negativity had persisted, Fisher was concerned about how this negativity was now politically in crisis. Its presence was not a concern, but its impotence was. His accelerationist writing sought to establish a practical strategy for how this crisis might be overcome. Accelerationism, then, as hauntology's hyperactive cousin, was seen by Fisher and others as an analysis of the ever-increasing speed of technological progression under capitalism, which sought to understand how this speed was affecting human cultural production and the production of subjectivity. These accelerationist writers observed that, whilst capitalism continues to develop at exponentially greater speeds, we, as the contemporary subjects of capitalism, cannot keep up with the system we find ourselves enclosed within. As a result, culture stalls and causes drag on the system itself, which responds by pacifying our desires through superficial means and leads us to languish at the end of history. The continental philosophers that Noyce critiqued may have been incapable of preventing this acutely postmodern condition, but for Fisher, to blame them for its ascendancy was useless. No one else had gotten so close, philosophically speaking at least, to stalling our enclosure in what Fisher later described as our frenzied stasis. Nevertheless, it is from Noyce's initial argument that most critiques of accelerationism now emerge. He had defined the theory under his critical eye as harbouring the belief that, if capitalism generates its own forces of dissolution, then the necessity is to radicalize capitalism itself. The worse, the better. It was this that he referred to as continental philosophy's accelerationist tendency. It is a tendency that the far right have used to justify the encouragement of a race war. When Pete Wolfendale later argued that no one has ever held this position, he was attempting to clarify that accelerationism, in its newly affirmed mode, is not about accelerating the contradictions of capitalism in any sense. Whatever is being accelerated, and there are severe and significant disagreements about this, it is not contradictions. And whatever transition this acceleration aims towards, it is not societal collapse. By now, however, these objections to the accelerationist cliché too often fall on deaf ears. The reduction of Noyce's critique of continental philosophy has been affirmed in the worst sense, and, at the level of popular discourse at least, it has won out. The becoming of history. Considering the other materials discussed in the post-capitalist desire lectures, we could argue that, for Fisher, what must be accelerated is the process of history. We might recall, for instance, Francis Fukuyama's famous 1992 text, The End of History and the Last Man, in which he announces not an end to things happening as such, but instead the ultimate ideological victory of capitalism, the byproduct of which is the utter reification of history and our present hauntological stasis. This issue lies in the background of Fisher's third lecture, in which he turns to History and Class Consciousness, the 1923 text by Hungarian philosopher Georg Lukács. Whilst Fisher focuses on the latter half of the work's title, Lukács nonetheless differentiates between an unending process of consciousness-raising and an immediately given, that is superficial and fixed, self-consciousness of one's place within history. After all, we all know that history is written by the victors. For Lukács, capitalism's reification of history is one of the central strategies it has for cementing its position. He writes, "Reification is, then, the necessary, immediate reality of every person living in capitalist society. It can be overcome only by constant and constantly renewed efforts to disrupt the reified structure of existence by concretely relating to the concretely manifested contradictions of the total development, by becoming conscious of the immanent meanings of these contradictions for the total development." Many self-identified accelerationists believe that the exacerbation of contradictions is the aim of the game. Not so. As Lukács makes clear, we must understand contradictions in their totality if we are to act differently. This argument again foreshadows Fisher's psychedelic reason. We must remember, Lukács writes, that history is mutable. It is not, as had been theorized since Hegel, an insuperable barrier to a rationalist theory of knowledge. For Lukács, this is to say that human history is distinct from natural history. Our history is ideologically affected by our position in the present. Geological history, foregoing presently contentious debates around the so-called Anthropocene, is not. The events of human history, our wars, our elections, our culture, are not fossils embedded within the Earth's geological strata, although capitalism certainly implores us to think this is the case. On the contrary, history is not that which lies behind us in the past, but rather that which occurs here with us in the present. History is the story of our own becoming, and in order to maintain that position, history must engage in its own process of becoming as well. Lukács writes, "It is only in history, in the historical process, in the uninterrupted outpouring of what is qualitatively new, that the requisite paradigmatic order can be found in the realm of things. History only happens, he argues, when things change. And who has the true capacity to change things? Only the proletariat. History, he writes, that is true history, is the history of the unceasing overthrow of the objective forms that shape the life of man. History is the product, albeit the unconscious one, of man's own activity, the succession of those processes in which the forms taken by this activity and the relations of man to himself, to nature, to other men, are overthrown. The problem in our presently postmodern moment, however, is accounting for the extent to which the working class, broadly speaking, likes history reified, enjoys the certainty of its narrative and its placing of our very being in legible stasis. It is this charge that concerns Lyotard in particular, as a figure who looms large in both Noyce's critique and Fisher's affirmation of accelerationism. To return to Wolfendale's article on the topic, he explains that in mapping out some of the maligned theory's central philosophical antecedents, Lyotard's attempt to combine Marxism and psychoanalysis has many problems, but it does problematize the notions of desire and alienation in important ways. What Lyotard argues, according to Wolfendale, anticipating Louise Mensch's cynical critique by over 30 years, and rejecting it, is that there is no pure, authentic, or natural pre-capitalist form of life to return to. And so we must not disavow the forms of living and desire that have been produced under capitalism simply because of this fact of their genesis. However, where we go from here remains a lively field for debate. What the nature of a post-capitalist society will be remains to be seen. Predicting the split that would later define accelerationist discourses online in the mid-2010s, Wolfendale writes that our speculation on this matter can descend into a perverse celebration of capitalism's destructive and oppressive tendencies. I'm looking at you, Lyotard. But it can equally become a call for greater self-consciousness regarding how we construct our desires and ourselves. Here's looking at you, Foucault. An honest appraisal that refuses to be trapped within the nostalgic false consciousness that seeps unbidden into so much leftist discourse. Here, Fisher's psychedelic reason once again rears its head, with accelerationism, as an admittedly broad church, contending precisely with the ways in which a reason under siege from the irreality of capitalism modernity can still give rise, as Spinoza declared, to actually existing human freedom. For Lukács, what is necessary seems clear. When accelerationists argue that the only way out is through, they mean that the only way out is forwards in time and in history. There is no going back into the reified past. To attempt to do so is to accept the fate that the ideologues of capitalism want for us. As little agreement as there may be amongst other accelerationist factions, the process to be accelerated, in a Lukácsian sense, is history. What would Mark Fisher do? Unfortunately, the promise of this thought's further development was tragically interrupted. Following the Christmas break of 2016, Fisher's lecture series would not resume in the new year. As a result, his final lecture on Lyotard is bittersweet. Little is resolved, but following our engagement with these 5 lectures alone, we may nonetheless find ourselves in possession of a new knowledge, and indeed a new consciousness, regarding the circumstances in which we live, and in many ways have always lived. The 6th lecture in the series was scheduled to consider the autonomist movement in Italy in the late 70s. In particular, Fisher asked his students to read a chapter from Nicholas Thoburn's 2003 book, Deleuze, Marx and Politics. Although Fisher intended to focus specifically on the book's 5th chapter, on the politics of the refusal of work, it is nonetheless interesting to consider the fact that Thoburn's text is similarly concerned with the unrealized plans of a great thinker. Before his death in 1995, Gilles Deleuze had announced that his final book would be called The Grandeur of Marx. It remains an intriguing title, not least because Deleuze's seemingly unorthodox Marxism has dogged the political reception of his work for many scholars. But, as Thoburn writes, this unfulfilled promise of a final work on Marx leaves a fitting openness to Deleuze's corpus and an intriguing question. How was this philosopher of difference and complexity, for whom resonance rather than explication was the basis of philosophical engagement, to compose the greatness of Marx? What kind of relations would Deleuze construct between himself and Marx? And what new lines of force would emerge? Engaging with this question and showing its importance, Éric Alliez argues, it can be realized, therefore, just how regrettable it is that Deleuze was not able to write the work he planned as his last. But this is not an unproductive regret, for, as Alliez proposes, the missing book can mobilize new relations with Deleuze's work. Its very absence can induce an engagement with the virtual Marx, which traverses Deleuze's texts. The spectre of acid communism looms productively over Fisher's thought in much the same way. It is for this reason that these lectures have been gathered together and published in the present volume, with each discussion functioning as a bountiful toolbox to be put to endless use by the curious, provoking an engagement with the virtual communism that Fisher had in mind. It was certainly not Fisher's intention to publish his thoughts in a form such as this, however, but at a time when his works are being deployed in service of all manner of projects, there remains no better person to clarify his thought than Fisher himself. And it is a thought that certainly requires some clarification. In late 2017, for instance, acid communism was taken up in the UK by a soft left contingent directly linked to the Labour Party, who attempted to further embolden a resurgent democratic socialism by combining it with an entwined rave hippie nostalgia, even going so far as to call for a re-engagement with those aspects of hippiedom that Fisher was most suspicious of. Later renamed acid Corbynism to ground it more firmly in its contemporary moment, this movement did remain loyal to many of Fisher's concerns, such as the need to raise a newly collective consciousness. But it also retained many of the qualities that Fisher saw as detrimental to any resurgent countercultural cause. This movement also failed to take into account that central problematic within all of his writings, the crisis of the negative. This is to say that collective joy is a superficial salve for an individualized melancholy if neither is capable of producing the new. We must find a way to intervene in both, in their entwined totality, that is capable of moving us forwards. By disregarding this tensile core of Fisher's dialectically psychedelic project, any posthumous acid communism is doomed to be little more than a folk politics. And if the contents of the first 5 lectures of this course are anything to go by, Fisher had much more in store for his readers than that. With this in mind, it is our hope that these lectures will be a useful resource, providing a broader foundation to the acid communism project than has previously been available. In many ways, it is astounding that an interest in acid communism has been stoked by so little, and especially by something so unfinished, a testament to the lucidity of Fisher's drafts, never mind his finished texts. Whilst the texts gathered here may similarly warrant the label of drafts, they nonetheless constitute something much more than an introduction. We are presented instead with the partial unravelling of an Ariadnean thread, and this is an unravelling we are all implored to continue in his absence. This may be an uncomfortable suggestion to some. It is undoubtedly Fisher's capability as a guide in this regard, his talents as a stalker even traversing capitalism's weird and eerie zones, that has led to the growing interest in his thought since his untimely death. Even those who were not familiar with his work before 2017 find themselves expressing the same sentiment that has been expressed online over and over again. I wish Mark Fisher was here, to guide, to inform, to give us confidence, to give us a laugh. But, in each instance, it is clear that the questions Fisher asked of Lyotard and Sleaford Mods remain pertinent to his own project as well as those inspired by his legacy. Who will make contact with the anger and frustration he articulated? In addition, who will make contact with the joy and energy he created as well? The answer to these questions is not an individual but a collective. It was not Fisher himself, but a people yet to come. Note on the text. The 5 lectures presented on the following pages were produced using recordings made and shared by Nace Saverel. Readers may find a new Fisher here, a Fisher that most did not know. This is an experimental Fisher, developing arguments in real time, working to convince and raise the consciousness of his students that another world is possible. This is Fisher uncut, Fisher in his element. He waxes lyrical on a wide breadth of topics and manages to engage his students with some difficult concepts. It makes sense that this too would be Marx's sounding board for acid communism. Just as capitalist realism had been implicitly written for his A-level students at the Further Education College where he taught in the mid-2000s, in the hope it might drag them from their disenfranchised stupor, this was Marx passing on a toolkit for a new generation, or perhaps the same generation 10 years later, now fully engaged and looking to cut deeper beneath the surface of mandatory individualism, touch-screen capture, and infinite drudgery. As lectures recorded in a modern university, the original recordings are punctured by other goings-on. Instances of interruption have been retained to account for the ways in which Marx's thought would bounce around, ricochet between references, and recover itself when a particular thread had been lost. Edits have nonetheless been made on occasion to dampen the impact of these instances on the listening experience. Otherwise, these transcripts attempt to stay true to spoken cadences and turns of phrase, regardless of their idiosyncratic nature. This has been done to retain Marx's voice as much as possible, and even more importantly, the lucid, dynamic, and improvisatory lecturing style so loved by his students. In other projects of this kind, it is usually a given that such inconsistencies or interruptions are scrubbed from the record. But given the work-in-progress nature of the lecture series itself, and the open experiment that Marx declared he was inaugurating, it seems only right to try and retain the atmosphere of those early Monday mornings. They are idiosyncratic, divergent, and meandering, but they were anything but miserable. Student identities have been removed to preserve the right to anonymity. Lecture 1. What is Post-Capitalism? The 7th of November 2016. Mark Fisher, abbreviated to MF. We'll just go through the structure as I see it at the moment. As I say, you can contribute to it, you can shape it. It's an open experiment, this course, starting now, really. Okay. Well, what I was going to do to start off was talk about the negative inspiration for the course. I was going to play you 3 things. But I'll have to talk these through because the sound isn't working for a reason I can't understand. Fisher plays Apple's 1984 Super Bowl commercial, in which a woman wearing colourful sportswear, chased by security guards in riot gear, hurls a sledgehammer into a giant screen, before which sits an army of expressionless grey drones, reminiscent of an address by Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984. At the end, the advert declares, "On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. This is the first one. Anyone recognize this? Anyone seen this before? General murmuring. Yeah, it features in the Steve Jobs film, doesn't it? Has anyone encountered it before that? Yeah? Where have you seen it? Student number 1. Well, I haven't seen the Steve Jobs film. MF. Oh, you haven't seen the Steve Jobs film? Student number 1. But I think someone posted it on Facebook, I guess. I don't have a context here. I just know that it's an Apple Super Bowl commercial. MF. Yeah, it's definitely worth watching later with the sound. As I say, I can't fix the sound at the moment. The image itself tells the story here. I often polemically say, this is the most influential film from the last 35 years. It was made by... Anyone know who directed that? Student number 2. Ridley Scott. MF. Yeah, so Ridley Scott directed it, and you can tell, can't you? You can tell from the style it's very similar to films that he had recently made. He had redefined mainstream Hollywood cinematic science fiction via Alien and Blade Runner. From 79 and 82, I think, so this was 2 years after that. It's really the best film he's made since then, I think. Probably the only significant film he's made since then. What this did really was seed the idea of many of the tropes that are now, I think, standard in our imagining. The idea of top-down, bureaucratic control systems versus the dynamism of a kind of networked, individual mindset. And what is clever, I think, or certainly significant, all advertising, you could say, is a form of dream work. Dream work, as Freud says, involves conflation and a compressing, a condensing of different ideas together. All this does, if you look at the imagery, is it condenses Cold War imagery, which none of you are really old enough to actually remember, except historically, I think. Cold War imagery associated with the Soviet Union in particular. Negative imagery to do with dreariness, bureaucratic submission of individuals. If you look at the film, these grey drones trudge around being subjected to the ultimately top-down commands coming from the talking head, clearly referencing 1984 of Orwell. The Orwell estate wasn't too happy about the ad, but that's another story, we'll leave that aside. But it conflates that imagery that has long been associated with the Soviet bloc with imagery to do with big computer corporations, such as IBM, which then dominated the computer world. Apple is positioning itself as an upstart, as colour intervening into this grey, dreary, bureaucratic world. Apple is new. It's female, interestingly. It's colour intervening in this grey world of bureaucratic monoliths, where IBM becomes, in the advertising dreamwork, equated with the Soviet Union. This, then, is the new world that is about to break out of this monolithic, dreary, grey, boring control system. And that's what happened. In a certain way, it was prophetic. It was more than prophetic. You could say it was hyperstitional. It helped to bring about the very thing which it was describing. From my point of view, what I think is interesting about this, then, is the way in which it suggests there is a problem of desire in terms of capital. The thing about the Cold War imagery, what it's suggesting is there is no real desire for, or rather, there is only desire for capitalism. The communist world, like IBM and the then dominant corporate capitalist world, is boring and dreary, and that's an objection to it. The new capitalist world won't be like that. The new capitalist world will be about desire in a way that the communist world won't be. So that was part of the interest for me in that. I put the PowerPoint presentation up on the VLE so you can watch it with sound later. It's just inevitable you get these bloody problems, actually immediately disproving the underlying message of that Apple and Microsoft would be smooth and glitch-free. We've spent 5 minutes here and we know that isn't the case. Laughter. So I can't see any reason why that sound isn't working, but it isn't. Right. The second thing I wanted to show was this commercial from, I think, a similar time. Anyone seen this one? Mark plays Levi's 1984 Russia. As it plays, he describes some of the commercial's key features, in which a man nervously passes through border control in Russia as Soviet guards rifle through his case, unearthing Western magazines. Interrupted by the arrival of a superior, they allow the man through, who breathes a heavy sigh of relief as he enters into the Soviet Union and later his flat, removing a hidden pair of Levi's blue jeans from his suitcase. He's got his case there, a copy of The Face, then the Style Bible, the leading magazine of style culture in London. Here he is in his dreary Soviet world. It's all black and white. Look at his miserable flat that he's going to. Oh, but look! Laughter. His life is redeemed because he's managed to smuggle the Levi's into the Soviet Union. This wasn't just something made up for the commercial. Levi's did have that super fetishized quality in the Soviet Union. So again, what is this pointing to? The fact that it's not only that the Soviet bloc was repressive, politically repressive, it also inhibits desire, and blocks desire. These commercials came out then at what, in retrospect, we can see was the end of the Cold War. It didn't seem like it was towards the end then, in the middle of the 80s. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet system was so quick at the end of the 80s, no one would have foreseen it from the middle of the 80s. It still felt like a full-on Cold War that would continue for decades at that point. So those came from that period. The third thing I was going to show you, which there's no point showing you at all without sound. Student number 3. Can I just ask, where was the Levi's ad shown? MF. It was shown in the UK. It was a UK ad, yeah. It was made for the UK. Mark plays a clip from Louise Mensch's 2010 appearance on the UK comedy panel show, Have I Got News for You? This is former Tory MP and so-called chick-lit author Louise Mensch. I can't believe she's called Mensch. It's like a daft Martin Amis character, isn't it? Louise Mensch, who appeared on Have I Got News for You, the fairly lame, satirical BBC political show at the time of Occupy London. What she famously claimed was that the protesters of Occupy had no authenticity or validity because they went into Starbucks and also maybe they had iPhones. Certainly others said that. They've got iPhones and therefore they can't really be anti-capitalist. So there's a lineage, isn't there, I think, from those first 2 commercials into the Louise Mensch position. There's a narrative behind it, which is a story about desire. These protesters have the products of advanced capitalism, therefore it's not only that they're hypocrites, it's that they don't really want what they say they want. They don't really want a wealth beyond capitalism. What they want is all the fruits of capitalism, and ultimately that's why capitalism will win. They may claim ethically that they want to live in a different world, but libidinally, at the level of desire, they are committed to living within the current capitalist world. These 3 things are the negative inspiration for the course, where I'm going to pose the question, is there really a desire for something beyond capitalism? And partly this is informed, then, by recent debates on accelerationism, and this is probably the biggest influence on the course, which I was introduced to in 2 phases, really. The first was in the 90s, when I was closely exposed to the work of Nick Land, who we'll look at later, a very controversial figure who developed a form of, I don't want to say right-wing exactly, capitalistic accelerationism. His idea was that capital was the most intense force ever to exist on Earth, that the whole of terrestrial history had led to the emergence of this effectively planetary artificial intelligence system, which therefore can be seen as retrospectively guiding all of history towards its own emergence. A bit like Skynet in the Terminator films. Land's work is this intense poeticization of the power of capital. It's interesting that that work came out in the 90s at that moment of the high triumph of capital, after the collapse of the Soviet system at the end of the 80s. Land's work was really a play on, a development of, a kind of remix of earlier ostensibly left-wing thought, particularly the work of Deleuze and Guattari and Lyotard. And they tried to imagine precisely a kind of post-capitalism that would try not to involve retreating from capitalist modernity, but trying to go all the way through it. It was in the last few years that left-wing idea of accelerationism, the term accelerationism itself was invented initially as a negative term by Benjamin Noyce's book, The Persistence of the Negative, was repurposed by Alex Williams and Nick Cernek. Mark emphasizes the pronunciation of Cernicek as Cernek. That's how we pronounce it, which is from the horse's mouth. I think Nick's ancestors, when they moved to Canada, gave up trying to get Canadians to pronounce it correctly. Laughter. But anyway, they tried to repurpose this idea of accelerationism, this move into post-capitalism from a left-wing perspective. And actually there was a seminar here, a symposium here at Goldsmiths 4 or 5 years ago, where Nick and Alex, I think, really started to develop those ideas. So that basic question, the question behind a lot of the debates surrounding accelerationism, is post-capitalism imaginable? Is it possible to retain some of the libidinal, technological infrastructure of capital and move beyond capital? Those are the debates that have shaped my thinking over the last few years, probably one of the most important debates to shape my thinking, and therefore also shape the structure of the course. I'll just briefly go over the thinking of the structure of the 15 weeks. So this week we're looking at 3 different accounts of post-capitalism. What is post-capitalism? I don't think we'll know by the end of today, but we'll hear a bit about the 3 different accounts of post-capitalism: Nick and Alex's, Gibson Graham's, and Paul Mason's. Paul Mason's is a kind of syncretic account, really, based on lots of different theories, and I think the reading from this week is typical of the mix of reading that I want on the course. Somewhat theoretical, somewhat journalistic, also some cultural and political history as well. It's not a heavily theoretical course, I don't think, at least not theory as such every week. So, this week, a general introduction. Then, after that, I'm taking a broadly chronological approach. Part of what I want to look at is a lot of what is behind the accelerationist debates, but hasn't really come out into the open, which is to do with a more aesthetic side of the question, which I think we can see certainly in the work of Lyotard and Deleuze and Guattari, etc., in the 70s, to some extent emerging out of the pressure coming out of the counterculture of the 60s and into the 70s. The potential fusion of the counterculture with the left. We hear about this a lot from May 68 and all of that. I'm kind of displacing May 68 a little bit in the narrative of this course. I'm more interested in the 70s in lots of ways. The 70s in the US, partly, but also the 70s in Italy. And thinking about what would happen if this fusion of the counterculture and left-wing politics had been more successful, had persisted. We'll look at some moments where it flourished, temporarily, but it didn't persist. And in fact, the period that we're looking at is the period of neoliberal triumph. So what I want to look at next week is 2 approaches for that, really. Marcuse, who I'm seeing as really prefiguring the counterculture. Marcuse's book, Eros and Civilization, is incredible. I realized when I was thinking about this over the weekend, I've already mentioned Deleuze and Guattari a couple of times, but they're not on the reader. They are the spectres behind a lot of what we're doing. It's almost perverse that we had to leave them out. It's because they're already there in a certain form. But I also think it's interesting to look at Marcuse as a kind of precursor of Deleuze and Guattari, with the question of taking on Freud and desire, and the question of desire. Marcuse's incredible book Eros and Civilization is out of print, interestingly like a lot of Marcuse's work. Marcuse, from selling hundreds of thousands of copies of One-Dimensional Man, still in print, regarded as a major work, and now, as I say, a lot of his work is out of print. I think Marcuse was widely read in the counterculture, because his work anticipated a lot of the strands of the counterculture. So next week I want to play that off against Ellen Willis, who's a journalist and cultural critic who lived through the counterculture but also saw similar limitations of it. And what I particularly like about this piece by Ellen Willis is how it raises the question of what we'll look at later, of what Helen Hester calls domestic realism, which is a bit of a parallel to what I've called capitalist realism, i.e., the idea that domestic structures, the ways we organize our lives at home, are fixed and immutable, and we can't imagine them being any different. In the 60s, in the counterculture, people did try to live in a different way, did try to live in a more collective and communal way. It didn't work out. It stalled. It failed. It went wrong. Interestingly, Willis's argument is that part of the problem was impatience. People thought that we could overcome these structures very quickly. In fact, they are highly tenacious and will reassert themselves unless they are continually dismantled. Okay, so that's setting up certain coordinates, then, between the counterculture and the left, and I think that's the kind of democratic socialism or libertarian communism that Marcuse wanted. And Marcuse was a heavy critic of the actually existing Soviet system. Part of what I also want to think about on this course, then, or module I should call it, is the question of consciousness, which I think has receded in recent years. What I called capitalist realism, you could say, which is the shadow of this course. It's called post-capitalist desire, but it's also about capitalist realism and the rise of capitalist realism. As capitalist realism rises, as the idea that there's no alternative to capitalism becomes the ambient political assumption, in order for that to be the case, consciousness has to recede. Consciousness in the sense of, initially as theorized by Lukács in terms of class consciousness, but Nancy Hartsock's invaluable work on consciousness from a socialist feminist angle broadens this out not just from class consciousness, but from what I would call a subordinate group consciousness, and the importance of this. Marcuse, in the section of reading which I've given for week 2, talks about the spectre of a society which could be free, and I think this is almost a proto-accelerationist section of his work. He's saying, okay, once the problem of scarcity is resolved, which it effectively is under late capitalism, the problem is not that there isn't enough food to feed everybody. The problem is the distribution of the food. Scarcity isn't the problem. It's actually the maintaining of scarcity which is the problem for capitalism. The production of an artificial scarcity in order to conceal abundance, you could say, and a scarcity of time as much as a scarcity of actual goods, services, etc. Marcuse says, once this scarcity is overcome, capitalism has to work extremely hard at avoiding the possibility that people could determine their own lives and behave in a more autonomous way. This is, in a way, the driver of the emergence of capitalist realism, I would say, and neoliberalism is a part of that, is constantly having to thwart the potential emergence of post-capitalism, of people living in ways that are beyond the imperatives of capitalism. We'll see that Gibson Graham argues that we're already doing that, most of the time, in fact. Okay, so that, in a way, becomes a problem of inhibiting the emergence of consciousness. We'll see that in week 3 with the reading of Lukács and Hartsock, which will then condition a lot of what we'll do in the weeks after that. Week 4 is labor history, an incredible moment in the early 70s when, in the US, a lot of these currents came together with a new set of demands in the workplace, when civil rights, feminism, and class struggle came together. When we use the word intersectionality now, it just means horrible squabbles on Twitter, people calling each other out, all of that kind of thing. It's simply about a problem where things don't actually intersect properly, where instead of a development of a consolidated group consciousness, there are identitarian squabbles amongst these groups. What if the opposite were the case? What if it had been possible to develop a form of political struggle which would genuinely intersect all of these forms of subordination in order to overcome them? There were hints of this in the US in the early 70s. It's a great book, this. A great book of cultural theory. It's not really theory, it's cultural political history of recent years. Jefferson Cowie's book, Staying Alive, the 1970s and the Last Days of the Working Class. A book of 2 halves very much. The first half devoted to the positive explosion of libertarian communism, existential leftism, etc., and the second half about the defeat of the feeling of the new left as well as the old left. The old left was swindled, and the new left was stymied. Following on from that, then, Lyotard's text, The Desire Named Marx, from his infamous, what you can call later his evil book, libidinal economy. It makes the case, a particularly strong case, that there's no possible retreat from capitalism. There's no space of primitive outside to which we can return. We have to go all the way through capitalism. He makes this claim super specifically. Then we focus on Italy with Federici and Nicholas Thoburn's account of the refusal of work. You'll see how some of this played out on the ground, particularly in Italy in the 70s. The next few weeks after that, we'll devote to the counter-revolution itself, where we see post-capitalist desire in negative, I think, via the shadow it casts. If we can talk about this last 40 or 50 years now as being shaped by the spectre of a world which could be free, then we can see that spectre in the ways in which capital has set itself up to thwart the emergence of consciousness, autonomy, and the refusal of work. The horrific testing ground for that is, first of all, Chile. A democratic socialist project, close to the US, very different from anything to do with the Soviet bloc, technologized, had the so-called socialist internet, cyber sin, in place, destroyed. It can be said, it didn't work. What happened in Chile? It didn't work because there was a CIA-backed coup to destroy it. The military destruction of the Allende government in Chile, which I think then provides a kind of prototype for what would happen afterwards. In places like the UK, it wasn't quite so immediately violent. There was violence, the miners' strike, etc., but it was a kind of capitalist realist lab which allowed capital to experiment with these new forms of subjection. Week 8. We look at what I've called the invention of the middle, based on Carl Friedman's book, The Age of Nixon, and Penny Lewis's book, Hard Hats, Hippies and Hawks. In a way, this is about the suppression of consciousness again, specifically of class consciousness. The role that I think Nixon played in this, if you read Carl's book, is in generalizing a form of what Marx had characterized as a petty bourgeois psychology, which is the idea of being in a class position which sets you up outside class altogether. There is a class system, but you don't really belong to it. This is the appeal that Nixon made to people, the so-called Middle America, which encouraged people to see themselves as part of and from this petit bourgeois perspective, which could then be generalized as a form of suppressing class consciousness. So workers started to see themselves in terms of the petit bourgeoisie, and Nixon could plausibly make this pitch because of his own background. Unlike Kennedy, for instance, he didn't come from a great privileged background. He worked his way up. And this is key to the petit bourgeois psychology, the idea that you can produce your own position in society through hard work. We'll look at the way in which Nixon, despite his ultimate humiliation and failure, nevertheless the Nixon paradigm became something that has continued to this day. Mrs. Thatcher was very similar to Nixon in lots of ways, similar background, similar values, similar advocacy of this general petit bourgeois psychology, and we'll see how this played out in terms of this image of hard hats versus hippies. I think it was 1970, some construction workers famously attacked anti-Vietnam War protesters, producing this image of a reactionary working class versus effete students, which continues to this day, really. And the workers are therefore on the side of the middle, of the silent majority of Middle America, etc., and this production of a middle then produces a paradoxical space. How can everyone belong to the middle? It's impossible. When John Prescott, the new Labour politician, said, "We're all middle class now," well, if everyone's middle class now, then what are they in the middle of? But it seems to make sense, this pitch, as a form of direct suppression of class consciousness. Then we'll go on to post-Fordism and New Times. Stuart Hall theorizing New Times from one perspective, Verno and the Italian post-autonomists theorizing from another. Post-Fordism, then, is the big shift in the infrastructure of capitalism, a shift towards what we now call precarity, flexibility, flexibilization, casualization, etc., and infotechnology becoming central. We'll look at that there in Week 9. Week 10, techno-feminism, cyber-feminism. This, then, is part of the genealogy of accelerationism. Cyber-feminism, the techno-feminism of Firestone, who really thought that a lot of the problems of gender were material and technologically resolvable. So, for instance, once it's possible to have children from artificial wombs, that would obviously radically shift gender relations, etc. Compare her to Sadie Plant from the 90s, which you can regard in some ways perhaps as a neoliberal form of cyberfeminism. Sadie Plant worked closely with Nick Land in the 90s, actually. I've skipped out the most famous cyberfeminism, which is Donna Haraway, because I think you probably know about that anyway, and we'll look at either side of that. You can fill that bit in for yourself. A bit like Deleuze and Guattari, they can be added in as an extra bit. But on to Week 11. Accelerationism. I hadn't chosen Nick and Alex because we'll look at them now, and they informed the whole of the course, really. But we will look at Jameson's piece, Utopia as Replication, where he makes the famous, well, not that famous, the in some quarters famous claim, looking at Walmart as a form of utopia. Dialectical thinking. Really classic accelerationist move, which is to say, what if the infrastructure of Walmart was repurposed for entirely different purposes? That's a bad sentence. Repurposed for entirely different ends. And Nick Land's machinic desire, which is the classic statement of his form of accelerationism. So it's a kind of left and right accelerationism in closing there. So, a lot of the accelerationist debate actually came out of the impasses or failures of the anti-capitalist political movement since 2008. Part of that is to do with horizontalism, which was the critique of the idea of hierarchical structures. There's something problematic about the hierarchical structures of political organization. When they are instantiated, they are already oppressive. So if we want to prefigure a post-capitalist world, we must be horizontalist. We must work to always eliminate hierarchies wherever they appear. A lot of the left accelerationist stuff came out of a dissatisfaction of this. Part of this thinking is, then, a kind of fusion of anarchist currents with network theory. One example of this is this kind of peer-to-peer politics, which is Week 13. And Michelle Bowens is probably the most famous example of that. We'll also look at the most famous thinkers of the network in Week 12, Hart and Negri, the unofficial theoretical. What's a non-hierarchical way of putting this? The inspiration behind Occupy, etc. Hart and Negri, of course, had been involved in Italy in the 1970s with autonomia and those struggles. So there is a direct lineage back to the sort of stuff we looked at earlier. Then we'll look at Jodi Dean's critique of this. We'll spend 2 weeks looking at the network. First of all, a long section from Commonwealth by Hart and Negri, which I think is their best book, actually. And then we'll look at peer-to-peer, and we'll look at Jodi Dean's critique of all this. Week 14, Back in the Bleak. Touchscreen capture, as I've called it. Then looking at Baudrillard, who I think gives an astonishingly prescient account of the tactile power, as he calls it. They come to touch, he says. Read a lot of his passages from the 70s, and it reads astonishingly like he's time-travelled into now, and he's talking about Twitter and the touchscreen interface. Next to that, Franco Berardi's famous critique of current conditions of info-labour and precarity. Berardi, one of the few contemporary thinkers who takes Baudrillard seriously. Then, to end it on a more positive note, Prometheus Reborn, although that's probably a too organic way of putting it. I think some of these currents come together in an exciting way in the Xenofeminist Manifesto from 2015, so only last year, and Helen Hester's piece, Promethean Labours and Domestic Realism. I think this offers all sorts of exciting possibilities for a post-capitalist politics at the current moment, so we'll try to end it on a positive note. So that's the thinking behind the whole structure. Any questions on that? Just interrupt me at any time. I hope I don't speak as much in the future weeks, but we need to warm up, I guess. Does that make sense? Is that sort of what you were expecting, or is anyone crushingly disappointed with that? Laughter. What's absent from it, I think, and what I want to be more present, you can perhaps bring this in, is the question of aesthetics, artwork, and culture, and its role in all of this, which I think is key, and have been underestimated by elements of the so-called old left. Let's go on to today then, because otherwise we'll never get through everything. I've basically just summarized some of the key claims. Okay, before we get to that, I've got way too much stuff, but never mind. It's better to have too much than too little. Okay, so, what are the advantages of the concept of post-capitalism? And just initially, I think it's worth thinking about this. Why use the term post-capitalism rather than communism, socialism, etc.? Well, first of all, it's not tainted by association with past failed and oppressive projects. The term post-capitalism has a kind of neutrality that is not there with communism, socialism. Although this is partly generational, I think. The word communism has lots of negative associations for people of my age and older. It implies victory. That's the other thing, isn't it? If you're talking about post-capitalism, it implies that there's something beyond capitalism. It also implies direction, doesn't it? If it's post-capitalism, it's a victory, and a victory that will come through capitalism. It's not just opposed to capitalism, it is what will happen when capitalism has ended. It starts from where we are. It's not some entirely separate space. I think that's implied, right? The concept of post-capitalism is something developed out of capitalism. It develops from capitalism and moves beyond capitalism. Therefore, we're not required to imagine a sheer alterity, a pure outside. That's one of the emphases of post-capitalism. We can begin with, work with, the pleasures of capitalism as well as its oppressions. So we're not necessarily trapped in this Louise Mensch world where, if we have iPhones, we can't want post-capitalism. Although, I don't think we'd want iPhones in post-capitalism. Anyway, yes. Student number 4. But doesn't it sound a bit more like a theory in comparison to a political system? MF. It sounds more like a theory. But that's a potential problem with it, yeah. Actually, I've got a few problems with it, gesturing towards points made on slide. I've sort of said that with the second point there. I think you're making a slightly different point. Student number 4. Because socialism and communism have an active. MF. Yeah, it's a positive actual project, whereas post-capitalism might be too theoretical. Also, it's tied to capitalism. That's also a problem, potentially. Gibbs and Graham talk about capital centrism. If we're talking about post-capitalism, then, if we're framing the outcome of our political, cultural, social ambitions in terms of post-capitalism, they're still defined in relation to capitalism, so it doesn't relate to a positive project. Reading slide. It remains in the temporality of the post. So it sounds like postmodern. It's defined by something that preceded it, rather than what it actually is itself. It's not necessarily progressive. In this new book from Verso, 4 Futures, Life After Capitalism, I think some of it's online, the book makes the case that just because something is post-capitalist doesn't mean it is desirable. Extinction is one of the phrases or models for post-capitalism put forward in the book. Another is a kind of high-rent, super-capitalist form of accumulation that is in some sense not calculable anymore. We might add to these. You might have some of your own. Yeah, please. Student number 5. Yeah, I have 2 more. MF. 2 more? 2 more problems? Okay. Student number 5. Yeah, it's not only that it does not name a positive project, but it does not also name a negative project. For example, some negative aspects of capitalism that we would want to refuse. I have in my mind the strategies of refusal of the autonomists, for example. Also, it is really easy to be lost inside this prefix of post, some postmodern narrative, not to define anything at all, just to talk about some post-capitalism that may fall from the sky. MF. Yeah, I think these are all potential issues with the course. We can think about these as we develop. You probably have more, which we can add as we carry on. Some of you might want to write on this anyway. Generally, is the concept of post-capitalism good? Is it worth persisting with? I've alternated. I was firmly against using anything in terms to do with communism a few years ago, because of the tainting problem, I think, more than anything else. But I've been persuaded that it's the very antagonism, the very alterity of the term communism, that gives it its potential power. Student number 4. Why should it be like communism anyway? To use an old MF. Yeah, I think when it's paired with new terms, that's what makes it interesting. The emergence of things like luxury communism as a formula, because it's immediately... Maybe we'll talk about luxury communism later on in the course. I think what's powerful about that is it deflects or diffuses, or not diffuses, but its opposite, explodes, the current conceptions of things or the standard stereotypes. Exactly what we looked at with that dreary, grey imagery associated with the communist Soviet system. How could that be luxury? It's a kind of cognitive bomb, something like luxury communism. I've also been trying to work on a concept of acid communism. That's what Deleuze and Guattari argue. And that's some of what we'll look at with the Jefferson-Cowie stuff, the early 70s. Psychedelic consciousness plus class consciousness. That's what capital feared in the late 60s, early 70s. What if the working class become hippies? Because surely key to the counterculture, for all its failings, and it had many, was an anti-work ethic. Mainstreaming an anti-work ethic. The Beatles did it. Stay in bed, float upstream was anti-work. And also the question of anti-work and anti-being busy. A different existential mode. And also this question of communal living. So I guess my current position would be, use communism with a modifier to break out of the existing associations, which a lot of young people don't have anyway, as I said, but you don't seem happy with that. Student number 4. Yeah, no, I think it's super difficult. There was a socialist system. If you're in Germany or in Austria or whatever, you still kind of know what it was about, and it's still very difficult to work with those terms. MF. I think it's partly a strategic question, isn't it? About when these terms can be used in what context. Student number 4. Yeah, of course. MF. And what force they can exert. It may be that they don't have universal applicability. Okay, so these are the big questions, but let's turn to specifics. Oh no. Laughter, as there are more technical difficulties. Okay, so I got this from online. Mark brings up 2 diagrams detailing a wide range of intersecting and contemporary ideas regarding post-capitalism, including their influences and related projects. You can see the range of different forms of post-capitalism, and almost none of those are ones that I've been talking about. Laughter. It's worth looking at later in more detail. Lecture 1. Continued. Okay, so let's look at some of the reading from today. Gibson Graham. I think one of the important things they highlight is the problems on the left of facing an attempt to theorize, imagine is probably a better word than theorize, a way out of capitalism. So, first, there is this suspicious, paranoid, strong theory of post-capitalism, which they get from Sedgwick. While it affords the pleasures of recognition, of capture, of intellectually subduing that one last thing, it offers no relief or exit to a place beyond. If we want to cultivate new habits of thinking for a post-capitalist politics, it seems there is work to be done to loosen the structure of feeling that cannot live with uncertainty or move beyond hopelessness. What they're saying then, Gibson, Graham, is that this failure of the imagination is a pathology of the left itself. This is associated with left melancholia. If people have not read Wendy Brown's essay on left melancholia, it's really worth looking at. It's what they're referring to extensively here. So, as they put it, in which attachment to a past political analysis or identity is stronger than the interest in present possibilities for mobilization, alliance, or transformation. Certainly, the left has experienced monumental losses, and perhaps ultimately a loss of confidence, in the viability of state socialism, the resiliency of social democracy, the credibility of Marxism, the buoyancy and efficacy of solidarity movements. Rather than grieving and letting go, the melancholic subject identifies with lost ideals, experiencing their absence as feelings of desolation and dejection. We come to love our left passions and reasons, our left analyses and convictions, more than we love the existing world that we presumably seek to alter. I think anyone who's read any account of left-wing politics will recognize these pathologies, right? In our fixation on the past, which I think is related to this problem of the inability to deal with the contingencies and uncertainties of the present, there's a clear relationship to paranoid total theory, which in effect says nothing can happen. It's what I call a harsh Leninist superego, which I think is related to this. A harsh Leninist superego was out in force when Syriza emerged in Greece. Harsh Leninist superego, this isn't going to work. Well, it didn't work. But it's better that it was tried than it wasn't tried, you could say. The harsh Leninist superego is out in force with Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party. Oh, this isn't going to work. This kind of thing doesn't work. Well, what would work? Only a complete transformation of everything, which is not really imaginable. So, what typically happens is there is a model of political transformation, a Bolshevik sort, which is positive. That's the only way to really change things, and anything that falls short of that will be regarded as having failed. Of course, the fact that the Bolshevik Revolution ultimately failed, and failed straight away, some would argue, is not going to reckon into this at all. I can strongly sympathize with what they're seeing there, this left melancholia. Now, moralism, I think, then. Another important essay by Wendy Brown that they refer to is Wounded Attachments. Wounded Attachments is highly prophetic of aspects of today's left-wing world, really. What Brown does in Wounded Attachments is draw upon Nietzsche to show that the ways in which certain kinds of left-wing desire have been mobilized, such that identities are defined in relation to a kind of wounding. Moralism, they say, provides an emotional shoring up of the reactive stance of the weak, who define themselves in opposition to the strong. With the dissolution in recent times of positive projects of socialist construction, left moralism has been energized by increasing investments in injury, failure, and victimhood. When power is identified with what is ruthless and dominating, it becomes something the left must distance itself from. lest it be co-opted or compromised. So the idea there is then that power itself is pathological. To hold power is to inherently be oppressive. Therefore it's better to be wounded. It's better to be the wounded, the abject, because you're not actually holding power, which is oppressive. This becomes the name for a kind of impossible desire in lots of ways. Who are these appeals aimed at? What is a political project which doesn't aim at capturing power or building power in some way? I think we can recognize the ways in which this form of desire has shaped a lot of left-wing politics recently. Brown's essay is highly profound. Both of those, Wounded Attachments and the one on left melancholia, which builds on Walter Benjamin's discussion of left melancholia. So in a way, in the place of a positive political project, we have a moralistic project of condemnation. We condemn those in power. Fearing implication with those in power, we become attached to guarding and demonstrating our purity, rather than mucking around in everyday politics. Those who engage in such work may find themselves accused of betraying their values, sleeping with the enemy, bargaining with the devil, all manner of transgressions and betrayals. It's interesting how that accusation comes from two angles, you could say. One is from this position of the wounded, who say you should never truck with existing power, and also comes from the position of those who would have ultimate power, like Leninists. They would make the same criticism as well. Don't be tempted by any attempt to engage with the currently existing political structures, or structures of power, because you'll be compromised by that. And then I like their analysis, but the films they reference are awful, aren't they? Laughter. I doubt anyone who's not British will have seen Brassed Off, but you've probably seen the full Monty. Have you? Yeah? Yeah. It's incredible how they literally say they're ecstatic about the film. Those films. I can't say I like 'em. Laughter. I've sort of gone against my aesthetic preferences, I think, in including them. Laughs. But it's the analysis, I think, then. I think they write something similar with Brassed Off. I don't think you've seen that film, but you feel like you know what it's about. You know, brass band and colliery. It's all there, this kind of left melancholia. Detached political nostalgia for these older forms of masculine labour. You know, this fixation on. I think that part of the problem is this fixation on resistance action, which is part of this kind of reactive model. Capital does stuff, we resist it. I think they rightly identify the impasses of this modernist class politics, as they call it in something like Brassed Off, which exemplifies a lot of their critique. According to them, then, dislocation, moving beyond capitalocentrism. We can begin to unfix economic identity by deconstructing the dominant capitalocentric discourse of economy, in which capitalist economic activity is taken as the model for all economic activity. We can dislocate the unity and hegemony of neoliberal global capitalist economic discourse through a proliferative queering of the economic landscape and construction of a new language of economic diversity. I think the key thing for them is there's no such thing as the economy. The economy, the definite article, is fake. It is a kind of fiction, a kind of operative fiction which secures capitalist hegemony. At the level of empirical reality, there are multiple economic activities, but at the level of hegemonic narrative, it's all about capitalism. So capitalocentrism is what capital does. But I think they worry about reproducing it in terms of left-wing theory and practices. So they've got this model there. If we look at what goes on in the world, they say, wage labour produce for a market in a capitalist firm is a tiny thing. When we look at all the other forms of work that go on, in schools, on the street, in neighbourhoods, families, unpaid, time between friends, you get the basic point. If you take this model, then, there is not one economy, there's lots of different forms of engagement with production. So there must be economies that are already non-capitalist. So they argue that it's partly to escape what I call the harsh Leninist superego, or these Leninist models. They think that what we need is alternative organizational forms inspired by feminist experimentation, organizational horizontalism, direct and equitable participation, non-monopoly of the spoken word or of information, the rotation of occasional tasks and responsibilities, the non-specialization of functions, the non-delegation of power. The thing is, then, you could make massive change, that's what this second large quote is saying, without the need for a vanguard party, like the Leninists thought. By Leninism simply meaning the idea of the revolution will be led by a small elite in a political party. The party organizes the subordinated class and leads them. They're arguing for this more horizontalist model, then, coming out of feminism, embodied practices, self-cultivation, emplaced actions, etc. So, a new set of effects. The effects associated with this becoming community are not those traditionally linked to left politics. So not outrage and anger, not cynicism and righteousness, wonder, delight, etc. In this utopian atmosphere, distrust, misrecognition, and judgment are temporarily suspended, and a solidarity develops that is based not on sameness, but on a growing recognition that the other is what makes self possible. I'm really desperate to get out of the Full Monty now. It's astonishing. In the Full Monty, you know what happens, right? It's in Sheffield, isn't it, I think? Yeah, northern town in England, anyway. Big problem with unemployment. Men are miserable. What do? They decide to take up stripping, basically. So Gibson Graham, for them, this releases this new affect. A release from this old form of masculinity, which is good. But I think it's Zizek's critique, which they mention. Is this not just a form of entrepreneurialism? Is this not just a form of flagellation? The factories have closed, let's just make our own business. They're getting something different from that which they're referring to. I think the important thing to take from this is that these other forms of affect are important. Part of the story, I would say, a big part of the story that I want to be pushing over this module is, what is the alternative to ressentiment? We'll talk about this when we look at Carl Friedman's work on Nixon. The neoliberal program, despite its emphasis on freedom, is really, I think, a lot about ressentiment. What are the alternatives to that? Solidarity is one word for that, but I think it's tainted by association with Leninism for me. What about a word like fellowship? How does that develop? What are the spaces and conditions for that? I think this is one thing I'd like you to get out of the seminar. So they talk about the community economy versus the mainstream or capitalist economy. I'm going to speed up a bit through the rest of the book. These are the kind of principles they're talking about, surviving together well and equitably, distributing surplus to enrich social and environmental health, encountering others in ways that support their well-being as well as ours, consuming sustainably, caring for, maintaining, replenishing, and growing our natural and cultural commons, investing our wealth in future generations so that they can live as well. An economy centered on these ethical considerations is what we call a community economy, a space of decision-making where we recognize and negotiate our interdependence with other humans, other species, and our environment. In the process of recognizing and negotiating, we become a community. This is their model of post-capitalism. Notice how some of this sounds like uncontroversial mainstream rhetoric. Bank adverts could incorporate this model. Sustainability. It doesn't mean they're really going to do it, but that indicates some of the pressure that some of these discourses are having on the mainstream. Okay, is this just folk politics, though? I guess this is the question. So there's their diagram of the economy versus the community economy. So economy is aspatial and global. Community is place-attached. Economy is specialized. Community is diversified. Economy is centered. Community economy is decentered. Privately owned, community owned, etc. You get the picture. But is this just folk politics? This concept of folk politics, then, was developed by Alex Williams and Nick Cernek, partly because of the failures of post-2008-2009 anti-capitalism. There was a certain level of success that the groups managed to achieve, but that was limited, and according to Nick and Alex, one of the reasons for that was the effect of folk politics. They argue that the most important division in today's left is between those that hold to a folk politics of localism, direct action and relentless horizontalism, and those that outline what must be called an accelerationist politics, at ease with a modernity of abstraction, complexity, globality, and technology. The former remains content with establishing small and temporary spaces of non-capitalist social relations, eschewing the real problems entailed in facing foes which are intrinsically non-local, abstract, and rooted deep in our everyday infrastructure. The failure of such politics has been built in from the very beginning. By contrast, an accelerationist politics seeks to preserve the gains of late capitalism while going further than its value system, governance structures, and mass pathologies will allow. Are Gibson Graham folk politics in that sense? Student number 6. Sorry, could you repeat that? MF. Oh, it was partly rhetorical. Is what Gibson Graham are proposing folk politics in that sense? Take the term folk politics. It comes from a critique of folk psychology that was developed by neurophilosophers. Neurophilosophers argue that folk psychology is no good. The concepts that we have in everyday life, including things like emotions, the way we describe what goes on in our brains, is no use for what actually goes on in our brains, and really inhibits the study of what the brain actually does. In the same way, then, Nick and Alex are taking this analogy and applying it to a political process, arguing that the spontaneous concepts that we have in everyday life to understand political systems, just simply the political economic system, have no purchase on the reality of something like capital, finance, capital, etc. There's a kind of mismatch between the two, and it would seem on the face of it that Gibson Graham could fall into folk politics. I don't think they fully do, actually. There is a model of hegemonic takeover. They don't think they can just operate locally. There has to be some kind of hegemonic struggle. I think we can see a tension already, then, between the approach that Nick and Alex advocate in the Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics and the Gibson Graham approach. But as they develop their argument in this book, which some of you have got, Inventing the Future, their claims become somewhat softer than they were in the Accelerationist Manifesto. How do we get there? We need demands. There has been this talk of a politics without demands, a demand-less politics. They're saying, well, demands are crucial. A politics without demands is simply a collection of aimless bodies, a provocative claim. And these demands should take the form of non-reformist reforms. These reforms have utopian and antagonistic components, and are based in actual tendencies at work in the world today, pragmatic interventions. So, let's quickly go through what their demands actually are. Full automation. Without full automation, post-capitalist futures must necessarily choose abundance at the expense of freedom, echoing the work-centricity of Soviet Russia, or the freedom at the expense of abundance, represented by the primitivist utopia, And how much freedom can you really have without abundance anyway? So, the arguments for full automation are: it can lead to a society that liberates humanity from drudgery while also increasing the amount of wealth. It is already happening. Between 47 and 80% of today's jobs are capable of being automated. It can lead to a revaluation, and even elimination of certain types of care work, allowing a radical transformation of the domestic sphere. The demand for a reduced working week. Now this is interesting, isn't it? How this demand stopped being made. There was pressure to get the working week down, the introduction of the weekend. Now it's kind of stuck at 40 hours and going upwards, particularly in the interest of post-Fordist labour. So, it's a positive response to rising automation. In a capitalist dystopia, which we're in at the moment, the more automation there is, the more miserable things are, right? Because it means less work, more unemployment. It means that the power of workers in jobs is weakened. Reduced working week advantages: less commuting, less consumption associated with going into work. It will increase the power of workers, because if the dystopian model of automation decreases the power of workers, this would increase it. Universal basic income. It must be sufficient and universal, so it must be enough to live on. It must be a supplement to existing welfare arrangements, not a replacement for it, because that would be the right-wing version of universal basic income. 4 key arguments for it. Political transformation. The proletariat can subsist with a job which would increase net class power. Precarity is transformed into flexibility on workers' terms, and, as they point out, a lot of post-Fordism was the capitalist genie responding to the wishes of workers in a malevolent way. Okay, so you don't want to be bored in the factory forever. You don't want to be bored in the factory for 40 years. Fine. Have temporary and casual labour. So, it changes how work is valued. Boring, repetitive work would have to be higher paid if you've got universal basic income. If you've got universal basic income, you're not going to do boring work. Student number 7. But who decides what's the boring work? I mean, maybe someone is enjoying the factory at some point. Laughter. MF. Maybe. The point is that workers themselves could decide what they wanted to do or not much more. In a sense, the market can decide what is boring work. Student number 8. And I guess we can see already here in the UK it's not really, optimistic. Student number 7. Yeah, no, I do understand that. MF. Yeah, it wouldn't be decided by workers. Market mechanisms would decide it, because you'd have to induce people to do things which some people might find boring. It'd be great for them, though, wouldn't it? It'd be even better for them. If some people found boring work, what most people find boring work, to be interesting, in this world they'd be much better off than they are now, right? Student number 9. Can I just ask about inflation in relation to UBI? MF. Oh, God. Student number 9. I'm from Finland, so they're just starting UBI, but that's to dismantle the MF. Welfare state. Student number 9. Yeah, but what I was taught in high school was that once wages go up, then inflation goes up too. So we were taught it's really hard to get the great salaries because once the UBI... MF. God, I don't know anything about economics, really. Laughs. I tried to skip over this. Laughs. Student number 10. Maybe we are thinking in a capitalist framework, or a Keynesian frame. And these kinds of measures need another economic frame, so maybe inflation is not an issue here, because it would be part of another economy. MF. Yeah, it wouldn't automatically lead to inflation, would it? That's why it has to be sufficient. The UBI has to be sufficient for people to live on. Student number 9. But say in Finland, where everyone is getting €1,000 a month, wouldn't it still mean, maybe I want to get more money because I want to move over to London or whatever, and I'd still want to have my UK job, so I'd still get more and more money. You still need the higher paid jobs, or you still need someone to design an Uber app, and it's probably going to be me, I don't know, and then I'm going to be paid a lot because I'm the only one in the world doing the Uber app. So then it's like I'm not going to get paid £2,000, I'm going to get paid a lot more because everyone is getting MF. Yeah. But why is that a problem? Student number 9. Just salaries rising? Because if everyone's salaries are rising, then it means the people on UBI are not going to be able to afford the things that I can afford. MF. I think they're separate issues though, aren't they? One doesn't all of a sudden lift inequality, which is a separate issue to the inflation one, isn't it really? Student number 9. Then I guess we're not getting rid of the welfare state. You're still entitled to UBI. MF. Yeah, and the UBI has to be adjusted, I suppose, for it to remain sufficient. Yeah, sorry, I was drifting off a bit trying to think. But I think it's also what student number 10 is saying. I think partly why they're proposing it is that it starts to shift us out of this certainly neoliberal capitalist model into some other space, which is really difficult to imagine. What would it be like if there actually was a sufficient UBI? Because it does start to flip our minds, doesn't it? The things that are available now. Okay, so hang on. If we have UBI, then people won't do this shit work. They wouldn't do drudgery. Oh, well, hang on. Then haven't we got automation? Doesn't automation then come in to take on the role of this drudgery? It just flips everything. So what is the problem now? Automation becomes a positivity. I know this doesn't directly answer what you were saying, but this is why it's a revolutionary reform, in that it starts to shift the basic coordinates and models of life, work and society, etc. Student number 11. Would you also get, though, some industries being really neglected, and then others massively developing? For example, to be fair, the creative sector even now is less wealthy. It's interesting, but then, in this imaginary, would that be neglected altogether? Would there be any incentives? Student number 9. I'm a designer, and I don't do design because I get paid for it. I do it because I love to do it. And I wonder if there was UBI, I would do projects that are actually valuable rather than ones I just get paid for. Student number 12. Yeah, but I wonder about whether there's something there that isn't built into this value system, given this idea that we should just enjoy it. Is that a positive thing to reinforce? MF. There's only one aspect, potentially. It's not the only thing that would necessarily be happening, because partly it's about shifting the emphasis away from remuneration altogether, isn't it? I think with Gibson Graham the key thing is a diverse economy, with Nick and Alex's post-work, right? So you're shifting away from work and remuneration as a model anyway. So the fact that people could engage in this creative work without necessarily being remunerated at a high level, well, as we start to move into that post-capitalist world, does remuneration matter so much anyway? Student number 12. So it's more that, at the moment, it's that idea of workers being exploited in the current system. MF. Yeah, potentially. Part of the thing is the modesty of the model, isn't it? It's moving with existing tendencies somewhere that quite quickly takes us to a place that seems far beyond where we actually are at the moment. Even though it's feasible, logistically feasible, and not that big a step, that's the cleverness of it. So, a feminist proposal. Also, they're saying it allows experimentation with the family structure. It reverses the link between suffering and remuneration. I think this is key, the almost religious dimensions of what they're talking about. The Protestant work ethic, which was a kind of religious evaluation of suffering. Suffering is intrinsically valuable in itself. A counter-hegemonic approach which can draw upon already existing hatred of jobs. And this is a photograph from a program that was on a few years ago, which some of you might remember, called Benefit Street. Highly controversial, typical of Channel 5 in the UK, which specialises in these programmes basically about people on benefits and stoking up ressentiment against them, really. The idea that somehow their lives are better. They can be on benefits, but it's better to be them than you. You belong to the hard-working middle, chipping ice off your windscreen, going to work in the winter. But what that really reveals is that people think their jobs are shit. Laughter. People hate their own jobs, and that is why they think it's better to be on benefits than in work. Okay, let's quickly go over some of the Paul Mason stuff. Sorry, we're nearly running out of time. I'm trying to pack it in today. So Paul Mason's stuff is based on this theory of Kondratiev waves. This was the idea that capitalism renewed itself through these long waves of development. And I think he fuses this with a bit of autonomia. Theories that capitalism is partly driven by the antagonism of the working class. That when the working class resists capital, when it struggles against it forces capitalism to innovate. So, part of the problem at the moment would be that the very success of capitalism in subduing the working class means that it gets locked in stasis. This could account for why there's this downfall, flatlining growth rates and things like that. Economic stuff. Laughs. I won't claim to be an expert on economics, at all. It's the cultural dimensions of this that I have a reasonable grasp on. So, Paul Mason's stuff really is about information, isn't it? This is what he keeps emphasizing. Peter Drucker's Post-Capitalist Society. Peter Drucker was a management consultant. I haven't read this book. It'd be interesting to read it. The key thing is the centrality of knowledge in this post-capitalist economy. Universal educated person, this would be a networked individual, according to Mason. So, according to Mason then, the key thing is the emergence of information and of knowledge-based goods, info goods, which, as he says, operate by a principle of non-rivalry. If I have this pen, you don't have it. It's physical. If I have a PDF of Mason's book, it doesn't stop you having one either. Information works like that. In lots of ways, the fact we've all got it makes it better for all of us. So I don't lose anything by the fact that you've got it. According to him, this then introduces this new principle which is contradictory to capitalism. A basic law of economics, or of capitalist economics, is that everything is scarce. But it isn't. You can keep replicating digital files practically ad infinitum. They're not scarce. Open source versus Microsoft. Could Wikipedia have been created by capitalist dynamics alone? So could by market incentivization. Some people must be motivated by other things than profit, otherwise Wikipedia wouldn't exist. So for him then, a commons-based peer-to-peer production, this open-source form of production, is going to threaten the capitalist corporate model of profit-based economy. Sorry, I'm rushing through so we can have a bit more time for discussion. So he refers then to general intellect. Again, the influence of autonomia, Negri, and the like. The first to leap on the emergence of this text from Marx. The fragment on machines from Marx's posthumously published text, The Grundrisse. General intellect, a knowledge-based society in which workers stood and supervised machines. Supervised rather than operated machines. Knowledge is socialized in this world of general intellect, so yes, it becomes about knowledge and sociality. Technologically, we are headed for zero-price goods, unmeasurable work, an exponential takeoff in productivity, and the extensive automation of physical processes. Socially, we are trapped in the world of monopolies, inefficiency, the ruin of a finance-dominated free market, and a proliferation of bullshit jobs. Which is David Graeber's phrase. Read that essay if you've not read it, it's really good. Today, the main contradiction in modern capitalism is between the possibility of free, abundant, socially produced goods and a system of monopolies, banks, and governments struggling to maintain control over power and information. Everything is pervaded by a fight between network and hierarchy. The fact is that capitalism, with its tendency to income inequality, information monopolies, and financial power, is running out of steam. It's time to start thinking about something new. Okay, so for him, it is this info-knowledge model which is the key threat to capitalism. He sees it then as analogous with the collapse of feudalism and the emergence of capitalism itself. The 5 principles of transition are to understand the limits of human willpower. This is not understood by Leninists, the classic Leninist left-wing parties who thought that volunteerism would be enough to overcome capitalism. Ecological sustainability. We must change human beings as well as the economy. It's about changing us, and not just something outside us called the economy. That surely echoes Gibson Graham. That's what a lot of their work is about. You could say that their work is really emphasizing that above everything else. And perhaps, to adopt the perspective of the Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics, it's the emphasis on that without the other stuff that perhaps makes it so political. Attack the problems from all angles. So, again, it requires a kind of diversity, again echoing Gibson Graham. Maximize the power of information. I think this is about transparency, knowledge, perhaps linked in with WikiLeaks and all that kind of stuff. So, his steps towards this would be an accurate and open-source computer simulation of current economic reality. He thinks it's possible because of the computing power that's available now, which was not possible at previous points in history. A shift to a wiki-state model. Switch off the privatization model. Reshape markets towards sustainable, collaborative, and socially just outcomes. Make space for collaborative, peer-to-peer and non-profit activities. Force corporations to drive change. Suppress or socialize monopolies. Let market forces disappear. Some markets can survive, but it's the difference between market forces and markets, I think. It's quite interesting. And he's saying in energy, in order to reach sustainability, market forces must be suppressed entirely. Socialize the finance system. Pay everyone a basic income, like Nick and Alex. And unleash the network. Okay, just to summarize then, Gibson Graham, economic diversity, and a production of new kinds of subjectivity and affects. That's their emphasis. With Nick and Alex, it's those demands of basic income, automation, reduced working week, universal basic income, the shift to post-work. And with Paul Mason, then, it's this kind of info-knowledge model, a kind of open-source politics. So what do people think? Having rushed through Mason a bit, I'd just like to hear what people's initial thoughts are. Rank them. Which is the best, which is the worst? Student number 9. I don't really have a ranking. MF. No, That was pathetic. Don't really rank them. Student number 9. When I was reading the text, I was thinking of an article I just read about a really trendy leader or CEO of a company. And he said he had a burnout because he was working in a job where he didn't have any hierarchy. So no one was telling him what to do, and that made him have the burnout because he was having difficulty self-managing and stuff. And I was just wondering, in relation to the working ethic of no pain, no gain, what happens if you don't have to work? Would you do the fun Wikipedia stuff, or would people just become really lazy? I don't know, this is just something I wanted to ask. MF. It's a good question, right? But it's bleak, isn't it? Isn't Wikipedia already an answer to that? Wikipedia isn't work. They don't get paid for it. 200 people probably do get paid, but most people who contribute to it don't, and aren't working. So that's already an answer to that. Student number 9. Yeah, but now I'm at university. I've been reading a lot because I'm forced to read a lot. But also I like to read a lot when I'm not here. I don't do it because I'm forced to. I don't know. What do you feel? I feel like this is the argument of neoliberalism. Once you're in a job, you get stuff done because you have to. So what happens when you're not in that context? MF. No, it's a good question. But the argument is, isn't a lot of cultural production the answer to that? Most culture that's produced is not remunerated. At all, never mind about in a small way. Student number 13. You could argue that it would increase cultural production because everyone would have more time. MF. Yeah, I think this is good. Student number 14. What about culture produced under different circumstances? I think some of the most amazing things that people write are written because they're suffering from a system that they don't want to be exploited by. So imagine what would be produced if there was nothing bad out there. Laughter. The most interesting pieces of culture have always been counterculture. So I'm just thinking, what could a counterculture look like in a post-work society? MF. Okay, this is really interesting. But it does show the influence of this cult of suffering that Nick and Alex talk about. The idea that this suffering isn't crucial. That's one thing, but that's not necessarily repudiating what you're saying. Mark and various students talk over one another. Student number 15. Maybe there's some kind of resublimation of your capacity to do something else instead with more time. MF. Yeah, I mean, we're still faced with mortality. We still face loss. Work isn't the only form of suffering. Sorry, that sounded a bit sarcastic, but you know, other forms of suffering would be there. The full Promethean ambition would be to eliminate mortality as well, which the Soviets at some point thought would be possible. I mean, why not? What are the limits? This is Prometheanism. But, student number 12, I think you wanted to say something. Student number 12. I was just going to say, socially, the question of leisure time. You'd have to re-evaluate what that is in the face of post-work things. Like, why would you make stuff? The impetus would be different. There'd be a different drive to it. I don't know, I just keep thinking about that. MF. I just think about the Beatles. What does a post-work society look like? It kind of looks like what life was like for them, doesn't it? They didn't have to work. They'd made enough money, surely, by the early 60s to just not work. Then their most interesting, experimental stuff emerged. Partly because they were freed from the pressure of having to worry about salary. They actually sold more anyway. Is that a silly example or not? Isn't that what haunts us about the 60s counterculture? It was some indication of what a post-work society was. All of that was made possible by, reinforcing your point, partly because people got grants to go to art school and the like, and were freed up from the pressures of drudgery for a while. So, I think we've got some indication of what a post-work society would look like in terms of cultural production. But, of course, that doesn't necessarily answer your point, because that was still in the context of a broader society at work. But, as I say, you think about the Beatles or any successful artist who carries on working and does interesting stuff. Aren't they the argument against that? If only their early work was interesting, when immediately freed up from the pressures of work, I think your argument would be valid. But if, after a period of time, when they're effectively liberated from the pressures of work, their work, well, is work the right word for what they're producing? If it continues to be interesting, and in fact becomes more interesting, doesn't that suggest that you don't need at least that form of suffering? Student number 9. It's interesting because it really points out the myth that creativity can only occur when you're suffering, which in my opinion is bullshit. MF. Well, it might not be a myth. Student number 9. It is for me, at least. MF. It might be a myth, it might not be a myth. But the thing is, it's a bit hard to test it, I think, because we're in a world of suffering, so we don't know what a world without suffering would be like. But we've got some sense of what a world without certain kinds of suffering would be like, because we've seen what happens to certain people when they're released from it. Okay, this is a good start, isn't it? I think it's the kind of thing we want to be thinking about. It directly relates to what Marcuse would want to talk about, these questions. I'd like every week for someone to introduce the texts, not me. You can introduce it however you like. It doesn't have to be a formal presentation, but just start off talking about them, so it's not me starting off. Obviously, I've done it today, and I'll probably do something like this for next week as well, just as a sort of backup. Far too much of me talking today, but I think we've ended up in a space for more discussion. So, would anyone like to volunteer, then, to do Marcuse for next week? Student number 16. I'll do it. MF. Fantastic. And anyone for Ellen Willis? Student number 17. I'll do it. MF. Thank you very much. If you'd like to do handouts or a PowerPoint or whatever, you can do that. Or you can just raise a few points. Whatever you want to do. So you're starting off and not me. Student number 16. Just like a few minutes. MF. Yeah, just a few minutes. Yeah. Just key points. Things you want to discuss, etc. Okay, so that's that. That's the first one. Laughter. Lecture 2. A social and psychic revolution of almost inconceivable magnitude. Countercultural Bohemia as prefiguration. The 14th of November, 2016. A student begins the session by introducing Marcuse's concept of the dialectic of civilization, focusing on Sigmund Freud's use of the apocryphal story of the primal horde, first described by Charles Darwin, which Freud discusses in his 1913 book, Totem and Taboo. It is a fairly long and thorough introduction. For brevity, here is a brief summary. Freud invokes Darwin's thesis to explain the emergence of the prohibition of incest in society. Darwin deduced from the habits of higher apes that men, too, originally lived in comparatively small groups or hordes, within which the jealousy of the oldest and strongest male prevented sexual promiscuity, he writes. When the oldest male becomes frail and younger males contest his position, the victor will form a new community, and necessarily drive all the other males out. Freud argues, through references to various other anthropologists, that over time, this would produce what grew into a conscious law. No sexual relations between those who share a common home. Through this shift from social relation to conscious law, the figure of the primal father is substituted by a totem. This totem could be an object real or imagined. In some primitive societies, the sacrifice of the patriarch is transferred to the killing of an animal. In Freud's 20th century case studies, the figure of the primal father becomes more symbolic. Freud folds these various observations into his theory of the unconscious, and particularly his conception of the Oedipus complex, relating the symbolic form of the primal father to the emergence of the superego. What is key for Freud is that the experience of internalizing the prohibition of incest constitutes a foundational subjugation, that is, control and repression, of desire in society. Herbert Marcuse, in his 1955 book Eros and Civilization, takes these observations a step further, updating them for the times and exploring the extent to which the subjugation of human desire is today enforced through far more pervasive systems of control, and for reasons far more complex than the prohibition of incest and the principle of exogamy. Following the student's introduction, Fisher places the book in its historical context, as well as the wider context of the course. Mark Fisher. Okay. This is from 1955, then. Marcuse's text. Marcuse himself was a late member of the Frankfurt School, and continues in the spirit of the Frankfurt School, and particularly, I guess, in terms of the overarching project of some kind of fusion of Freud with Marx. I think there's a difference in tone from Marcuse than his predecessors, perhaps the best known of which is Adorno. And that tone, I think, is partly to do with the fact that Marcuse is far more a romantic figure in lots of ways. I don't mean in the everyday sense of romance, but in the more philosophical and cultural sense. He still places a high value on the importance of art. Adorno does this, but with Adorno, you get very little sense of what life beyond capitalist domination could provide. With Marcuse, I think you get a much stronger and more vivid sense of that. I suppose we have to ask the question, why turn to Freud at all? Why is Freud important? And that's a question we can pose to the Frankfurt School and also to ourselves in relation to this course. I suppose, in relation to this module, the answer is that even if we disagree with Freud's account of desire, we have to go round or past it, through it. Of course, part of the significance of Freud was that he made desire central, to his own theories, but also to his understanding of the way in which human individual psyches and the social world function. There's perhaps two ways in which this goes in Freud's work. The first is that quasi-biologistic naturalization of currently existing desires, so the rooting back of desires that are now available, or expressed even, to some kind of biological root. Anatomy is destiny, is the famous quote. But if anatomy is destiny, well, we can change our anatomies now. That's available in a way it wasn't to previous historical generations. That's perhaps not quite as deterministic as it first appeared, but that would be the conservative side of Freud. Biologistic and naturalizing. The other side of Freud, though, is the idea that there is no natural form of desire whatsoever, actually. This is what Marcuse is trying to cling to in Freud, the historical side of Freud's work. There is an interruption as students arrive late, a jostling of chairs and voices. Fisher says he will try and request a bigger room for future sessions. Okay, but I think the radical side of Freud then goes from this other dimension. The idea of the historicity and plasticity of desires. And perhaps the shift from the word instinct to the word drive is more than a kind of translation issue there. Anyone speak German? Yeah, so in German it's Trieb, right? The word. Rather than instinct, it's more like drive, I think. Student number 1. I haven't read Freud, and I don't know what he uses, but... Student number 2. Sorry, can you repeat the word? MF. Sorry. Trieb. There are murmurings of acknowledgement and understanding. Yeah. So how would you literally translate that? Student number 3. How is it called again? What you just said? MF. Trieb. Student number 3. Ah, yes. Student number 2. I'd definitely go for drive, but as you say, it's not the same. MF. Yeah. But there's a very different emphasis, isn't there? From instinct to drive. When that translation happens, it's a big decision. Okay, so what is the distinction, do you think? What's at stake? If you say something is a drive, how is that different to talking about an instinct? Student number 3. Instinct is very biological, no? MF. Right, yes. So there's a machinic or non-biological nature to drive, at least in principle, which implies the capacity of redirecting, reformulating drives. And also the fact that they are just not natural. They're not given in the biological nature of beings, of humans. I guess there is that one way of separating out human beings from other animals. You could say, do animals have drives? This is not a rhetorical question, it's an open question. I think we can pose the question, do animals have drives? Because we can say they have instincts, but do they have drives? I think we can also pose the reverse. Do we really have anything like an instinct? And if we do, what is the whole apparatus of Freudian explanation supposed to be doing, in a way? If there are already existing instincts, then why is so much cultural work required in order to... One of the radical implications of Freudian theory is that something like heterosexuality is the achievement of a massive process of acculturation. That it doesn't just occur. That there has to be a whole series of initiations, channelings, closing down of potential desire, which has to occur in order for something like heterosexuality to be seen as normative. So, I think that these two kinds of Freud are in conflict, or at least there's a tension between them, and part of the reason Marcuse wants to stick with Freud, instead of just ignoring him as a conservative thinker, instead of saying that then, he wants to say, well, no. If we flip it around, we can see Freud rather as a thinker of the historicity of desire. This is why we have things like the story of the primal horde. The story of the primal horde, which you referred to, haunts Freud's texts, most notably Totem and Taboo from 1904, and Moses and Monotheism from, well, I think it was eventually published in 1939. One of the themes of Freud's work in general, and of those essays in particular, is repetition. The big question of psychoanalysis, you could say, is the big one of the big ones, laughter, is why do we repeat things which are unpleasurable? This is the phenomenon that he observes in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And this is the distinction between Freud and a kind of Anglo-Saxon-style utilitarianism. You know that famous slogan of utilitarianism. Who's the founder of utilitarianism? Student number 4. Bentham? MF. Yeah, Bentham. Yeah. Simple stuff. It slips. Bentham is the headless mannequin. Or is it his actual body? Student number 4. It's his body, but they've got his head in a box and you can request to see it. MF. Yeah, which is at UCL? Student number 4. UCL, yeah. MF. Yeah, that's just bizarre. Whenever I think of Bentham, I think of headless Bentham. Anyway, Bentham famously proclaimed that mankind is at the mercy of two sovereign masters: pleasure and pain. Human beings will pursue pleasure and avoid pain. It seems obvious. But Freud discovers that this apparent truism just doesn't hold up, actually. Much of the time, we will pursue things which seem on the face of it painful. There is, in a way, a second-order level of enjoyment, which is the enjoyment of things which, on the first-order level, seem to be painful. And yet, part of the problem that Freud had with his patients was this attachment to a second-order level of enjoyment. Because if it's simply a matter of people being in pain, and that pain was straightforwardly undesirable, then you could fairly easily wean them off the pain. But if there's some second kind of satisfaction to be derived from things which were superficially painful, then it's much more problematic, and other attachments are formed. This is what stood in his way, and one of the key things that he finds. So, then there is this problem of repetition compulsion, which is central to Beyond the Pleasure Principle of 1921. It's commonly known that Beyond the Pleasure Principle, like civilization and its discontents, was substantially informed by the experience of World War I. Because one of the things that Freud was puzzled by was shell shock from the First World War. Shell shock, which is a phenomenon where people would repeat the trauma of a shell going off near them. So, if a book fell from a shelf, they would immediately be thrown back into the situation of a shell having exploded close to them. We kind of take this for granted now. Freud asked the naive question, why? Why do people do this? Because if an organism was simply motivated by staving off panic and moving towards pleasure, then what compels it to repeat these extremely unpleasurable things? Part of the answer for Freud is some kind of mastery over the trauma. The repetition enables the organism to claim the trauma for itself in a way. And he discusses this with the so-called fort-da game. He plays this game with his grandson. To do with the absence of his mother, who is spending more and more time apart from him, he plays this game, which involves, I think, some sort of small object that you throw away, and it's here, it's gone, it's there, it's gone, it's here, it's gone. And so, instead of simply avoiding the pain of the absence of his mother, he turned it into a game of which he could have some sort of mastery, and which tells him some sort of narrative in the process. This compulsion to repeat, then, becomes crucial. But beneath that, there is then this more metaphysical problem that emerges for Freud from the very basic drives of human beings. And this is where he starts to posit the so-called death drive, which is highly complicated. We'll broach it, though. Partly it's complicated because Freud himself is not fully sure what he thinks it is. You can see it in almost diametrically opposed ways in some respects. The first way to see it, then, would be simply as a destructive or aggressive drive, which is simultaneously also the drive towards self-destruction. And Freud starts to posit this as an independent drive from erotic drives, the drives for pleasure. But hold on a minute. You see, what he also starts to think is, well, is this really opposed to the pleasure principle, or another form of the pleasure principle? Because what the death drive ultimately seems to be aiming towards, at least in one of its versions, is acquiescence, peace, ultimate calm, the release from desire itself. This is the so-called nirvana principle. We can see it as if the organism is like an elastic band that is being pulled. It's in a state of tension, and there is this innate impulse towards the release of that tension, just in the tension itself. If I keep pulling the elastic band, something doesn't pull it back, it pulls itself. This is one way that Freud starts to think of the death drive. The death drive has to be pivoted in its aim, and this is how Marcuse essentially discusses it. The erotic drives are there to impede the goal of the death drive towards acquiescence. The organism finds its own way to death. That's the line that he takes. There's another way of thinking about the death drive. A lot of Lacanians take this view of the death drive. People like Zizek. The death drive doesn't aim at death. It doesn't aim towards a final state of acquiescence. It aims at, rather, I don't want to say an indifference to death. One of Zizek's examples is the red shoes. Has anyone seen that? Student number 5. What film? MF. The Red Shoes. Yeah, it's where a ballerina puts on a pair of enchanted dancing shoes, and they basically dance her to death. She's initially in a state of ecstasy, but eventually, she can't keep dancing at that sort of frenzied pitch, and so she dies. The point is not that she was taken over by something which aimed at killing her. It's that she happened to die because the drive made her indifferent to death. Indifferent to organic death. This is a drive that was stronger than the desire to avoid death. So, there are these two almost diametrically opposed senses of the death drive here. But what they have in common is this antipathy towards the idea of a utilitarian-style disposition of our desires. So there's all this to contend with, and this leads Freud, then, into his most pessimistic theses, which are expressed most powerfully in Civilization and its Discontents, which haunts this chapter of Marcuse's Eros and Civilization. Civilization and its Discontents, then. I think you explained this well, in reference to the student's introduction. The claim of Civilization and its Discontents is that discontent is inherent to civilization. It's not possible to imagine a civilization from which discontent has been banished. And you may remember Freud's famous claim that the goal of psychoanalysis was not to eliminate madness, which was impossible. The seminar is interrupted again by someone at the door of the classroom, for whom there is no seat available. There is more jostling of chairs. Right, so where were we? Civilization and its discontents, yeah. So, there is an antagonism between civilization and pleasure. Why? Well, the idea was, on a simple level, if people were allowed to enjoy themselves, if people were allowed to pursue their pleasure all day, they wouldn't do anything. Well, they wouldn't do anything except pursue that pleasure. They wouldn't produce the necessities of life. There wouldn't be agriculture, people wouldn't produce dwellings to live in, they wouldn't produce other kinds of goods which could be enjoyed, or which were simply necessary in order for life to exist. So actually it's not even conceivable as a thought experiment, because this kind of repression-free environment is not sustainable. It couldn't sustain itself. But here is a point that Marcuse picked up. What are the assumptions behind this? What are the assumptions behind the idea that this level of discontent is necessary? The assumption is scarcity, fundamentally. That is the fundamental assumption. Scarcity. The struggle over resources. The fact that there is a natural abundance means there must be work. If there is work, then there is someone to do the work. If this work is not in itself intrinsically pleasurable or enjoyable, then there must be some compulsion towards doing it. A strong compulsion which overrides people's more primary desire for pleasure. And so, given that that's all the case, this is the origin of repression as a response to scarcity. There is no civilization without repression. Repression is the foundation of civilization. That's it. And that's a tragic tale. In many ways, if Marcuse is in a lineage of romantic thinkers, then Freud, I think, fits himself into a lineage of pessimistic thinkers and tragic thinkers. There's no way beyond this at all. And that's why a lot of Marxist revolutionaries simply reject Freud out of hand, because they say it's just conservative. It's saying utopia is impossible, and it's impossible for quasi-biological reasons. But I think then Marcuse is working away at the fact that it isn't just biological, even on Freud's own account. It is historical, and it is to do with work. And history and work are not fixed and immutable. They are, by their very nature, changeable. And this is what Eros and civilization brings about then. It is trying to work through, or work a way out of, the tragic impasse suggested by civilization and its discontents. It's worth thinking again about the role of the myth of the primal horde that you talked about. What role this plays for Freud. A lot of Freud's work at this time is what I call retrospeculative, in that it was based on some kind of anthropology. This idea of the primal horde, he didn't just make it up himself. It's fairly weak empirically, but its function seems to be now, and even by Marcuse's time, more a kind of myth of psychoanalysis than something which is believed to have actually happened. So why did Freud talk about the primal horde? And why is he interested in it? Well, on both occasions, in Totem and Taboo, and Moses and Monotheism, what Freud is trying to account for is religion. Where does religion come from? Particularly Judeo-Christian religion. I think, as people have pointed out, the hubristic, crazy courage of Freud, when he was in London in flight from the Nazis, writing Moses and Monotheism, which in lots of ways undermines the very basis of Judeo-Christianity. Okay, so what was the argument there? The argument there, in both cases, was to do with the role of the primal father figure, which you talked about. The primal father figure, as you said, has exclusive, or at least first, claim on basic provisions and access to women. He has the first claim on that. But at some point in history, the brothers, who aren't necessarily biological brothers, the sons, who aren't necessarily biological sons, the father wasn't literally a father. The father was always, already, a symbolic function. But nevertheless, at this stage of history, or this stage of the myth, the symbolic father and the physical father are one entity, which can be destroyed in theory. So surely this would be the point, then, in which repression was done away with. Repression under the name of the father. What is this myth about, then? It is to say, where does repression come from? Why do people repress themselves? They are repressed because of the negative father. The father says no. I think it's Foucault who makes the pun the name of the father and the no of the father, which are similar in French, non and non. But the brothers get together and they think, there's loads of us and there's only one of that fat bastard. Laughter. Why do we continue to obey these strictures? Why don't we just overthrow him? So not only do they overthrow him, they violently kill him, dismember him, and eat him. I think this is quite central to sex, gender, species, if people are doing that. So they eat him. This is the audacity of Freud. It's amazing, right? He's saying this is the origin of the communion meal, which is bizarre when you think about it. This is the body of Christ which was given for you. So you eat him. Partly he's trying to say, where would such a myth have come from? He thinks only from some unconscious memory passed down where the father was actually killed and consumed. Okay, so that's it then. Jubilee, carnival, father is dead, no more oppression. No, not okay, that's not how it works. Laughter. What Freud's saying is, at this point, what happens Instead of getting rid of the father becomes eternalized in the form of guilt and remorse. The point at which the sons have killed the father, they don't leap around jubilantly. They feel guilty. And the father, from being a finite figure, becomes then a kind of virtual spectre who is infinite. You can get away from the physical father, but you can't get away from the introjected voice of the father, which is never satisfied, which is always calling for more, always making demands which can't be met, and which can't now be reasoned with. He probably couldn't be reasoned with before, but he definitely can't be now. This is the origins of the superego, and what Lacanians call the big other, the basic form of repressive authority within society. But what's interesting for Freud, what is also the origin of morality as such, is the fraternal feelings that the brothers have amongst each other. This is where morality originally comes from. Although there's no literal memory of this, probably because it never happened, even on Freud's account there is no literal memory of this, it's an unconscious memory which is passed down. The agency of the father, then, is the agency of mortification, the deadening of the flesh. In order to be initiated into society, you have to give up something crucial. You have to give up desire. And specifically, you could say, this is desire for the mother. Now we're back to the stereotypical core of what people think Freud is about, the idea of desire for the mother. But now I think we can see where this desire for the mother comes from. It isn't that the desire for the mother comes first. Instead, the desire for the mother stands in for some other desire, which is the desire not to exist at all as a separate entity. You've all heard about separation anxiety, the infant's horror at finding itself to be a finite entity, having to fend for itself in the world. What it's haunted by, then, is a myth, or an image in the Lacanian sense of the imaginary, of a vague, blurry, dreamlike sense of fusion with the mother. It's one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari say in Anti-Oedipus. Before there is a sense of a mother and a child, there is no difference between a mother and a child at all. It is this that is most earnestly desired. The annihilation of the individual subject and the return to the state of fusion in the womb. In other words, this is a form of death drive in itself, the annihilation of individual subjectivity, the return to a state of acquiescence, where you could say all desire is met, but where also there is no such thing as desire at all. If all your desires are being quenched, then you don't have desire anymore. That relationship between dying and satisfaction is irrelevant. Okay, so that's the big Freudian backstory. So where does Marcuse come in with this? Partly, as I say, it's to draw out that historical dimension. Again, the stereotype of Freud is about the Oedipal triangle. It's about everyone wants to have sex with their mother. But the question is, why is that the case? Does that provide a full answer? I think according to Marcuse, no, it isn't the full answer, because it isn't really the sexual or erotic drives that come first. It's the question of work that comes first. So, why is there repression? There's repression so that people work, so that people can be made to work. This is the fundamental switch that we need to make. He's saying this, then, not so much in that it's opposed to Freud. It's already there in Freud's text, but the emphasis is slightly skewed. So, what if people didn't have to work? What if not all work was unpleasant or painful? According to Freud, then, on page 70, which Marcuse paraphrases, the chain of inhibitions and deflections of instinctual aims cannot be broken. And then a quote from Freud. Our civilization is, generally speaking, founded on the suppression of instincts. And Marcuse continues, civilization is first of all progress in work. That is, work for the procurement and augmentation of the necessities of life. This work is normally without satisfaction in itself. To Freud, it is unpleasure, painful. In Freud's metapsychology, there is no room for an original instinct of workmanship. Then, a little bit further down the page, the basic work in civilization is non-libidinal, is labor. Labor is unpleasantness, and such unpleasantness has to be enforced. For what motive would induce man to put his sexual energy to other uses, if by any disposal of it he could obtain fully satisfying pleasure? He would never let go of this pleasure, and would make no further progress. That's, I think, something which we've just said. And on page 72, the work that created and enlarged the material basis of civilization was chiefly labor, alienated labor, painful and miserable, and still is. The performance of such work hardly gratifies individual needs and inclinations. It was imposed upon man by brute necessity and brute force. Now, you'll see that the two things aren't the same, are they? Brute necessity is one thing, brute force is another. And you can see this sort of doubling in a lot of those key myths, such as the myth of the kids killing the primal father. What he seems to say is that the father becomes the fool guy in a way, for the fact that you can't attain full libidinal satisfaction. There's an interesting narrative here if you follow it through. Initially, they're thinking, if only we got rid of the father, then we would be able to get this full enjoyment. But then they find it isn't just down to the father, actually. There's some other intrinsic problem which blocks it. Necessity itself, you could say. It's the nature of the world itself that means we would be unsatisfied. But necessity has to be enforced by domination. What we're partly seeing, then, is this repeated cycle whereby there is an initial rebellion. The rebellion succeeds to some extent, but ends up reproducing domination. Part of the value of Freudian theory for the Frankfurt School in general, for Marcuse in particular, was that this provides an explanation for why this would be the case. Instead of displacing the father, the rebels replace the father, and take on the function of the father themselves. From the slave revolts in the ancient world to the socialist revolution, the struggle of the oppressed has ended in establishing a new, better system of domination. Progress has taken place through an improving chain of control. Each revolution has been the conscious effort to replace one ruling group with another. But each revolution has also released forces that have overshot the goal, that have striven for the abolition of domination and exploitation. The ease with which they have been defeated demands explanations. He talks about self-defeat, then, as being key to it. Part of what is happening, then, is, and this is an interesting tension with Willis, who we'll come to shortly, he thinks the family, as you said, has less significance than it used to have. Why? Because it's the depersonalization of the superego. Just briefly, then, the tripartite division which Freud introduces in his later work, between the id, the ego, and the superego. The superego is the internalized voice of the father insomuch as it speaks of symbolic limits. Saying no, demanding more of the individual than the individual can ever meet. The superego is the introjected forces of social repression, but it's not a rational agency. Let's be clear about that. Its demands cannot be met. The id, then, would be the entity which sought for more direct satisfaction of desires, and the ego really does not exist in and of itself. It exists as the mediation of the tension between those two things. The superego function is closely associated with the father in older forms of society, but then becomes distributed through institutions of administration in contemporary society. And that means that partly it's a problem that has been there since the killing of the father figure failed. There's no one to blame. Everyone's guilty, but no one is. So, as he says, you just face smiling officials. It's sort of their fault, but it's not really, because the whole system is a system of constraints and repressions, of which they are themselves victims. They are not the authors of these things. How do we get out of this? The concept of surplus repression is key, which you touched on. In most imaginable societies, some level of repression is required in order for people to produce anything. But then surplus repression is the additional social repression on top of that, beyond necessity. Beyond quasi-biological necessity, there is also cultural and social pressure. The key thing for me is scarcity. Modern society really ought to be, in many ways, the most repressive, considering the generalization of the father function far beyond the father. However, there is the other side to it. Technology, in particular, has produced the conditions for the elimination of scarcity and the removal of drudgery. This is on page 76. The excuse of scarcity, which has justified institutionalized repression since its inception, weakens as man's knowledge and control over nature enhances the means for fulfilling human needs with a minimum of toil. The still prevailing impoverishment of vast areas of the world is no longer due chiefly to the poverty of human and natural resources, but to the manner in which they are distributed and utilized. This difference may be irrelevant to politics and to politicians, but it is of decisive importance to a theory of civilization which derives the need for repression from the natural and perpetual disproportion between human desires and the environment in which they must be satisfied. If such a natural condition, and not certain political and social institutions, provides the rationale for repression, then it has become irrational. The culture of industrial civilization has turned the human organism into an ever more sensitive, differentiated, exchangeable instrument, and has created a social wealth sufficiently great to transform this instrument into an end in itself. The available resources make for a qualitative change in the human needs. Rationalization and mechanization of labor tend to reduce the quantum of instinctual energy channeled into toil, alienated labor, thus freeing energy for the attainment of objectives set by the free play of individual faculties. Technology operates against the repressive utilization of energy insofar as it minimizes the time necessary for the production of the necessities of life, thus saving time for the development of needs beyond the realm of necessity and of necessary waste. But the closer the real possibility of liberating the individual from the constraints once justified by scarcity and immaturity, the greater the need for maintaining and streamlining these constraints, lest the established order of domination dissolve. Civilization has to defend itself against the spectre of a world which could be free. This is Marcuse as a kind of accelerationist. And this carries on page 80, which is where he sounds the most accelerationist. What is retrogressive is not mechanization and standardization, but their containment, not the universal coordination, but its concealment under spurious liberties, choices, and individualities. He continues, after a typical Frankfurt School list of the miserable pleasures of modern society, refrigerators and apartments, they have innumerable choices, innumerable gadgets which are all of the same sort and keep them occupied and divert their attention from the real issue, which is the awareness that they could both work less and determine their own needs and satisfactions. Just to summarize, for me this is the core of what is a significant text for this module. Marcuse identifies the long history of dynamics behind the performance principle, or, as you said, what I think is virtually identical with the work ethic. He's a kind of romantic and a Kantian in lots of ways. He follows the classical lineage of philosophy, which is saying, what is freedom? Freedoms are things that are pursued for their own ends, rather than for extrinsic ends, rather than for ends imposed upon us by others. When there is scarcity, we first of all have to deal with that scarcity as a problem. We have to engage with that scarcity. It really has to be dealt with. But when technology can do a lot of that work for us, then that excuse no longer remains. What you have then is a sheer amount of surplus repression, which is just about maintaining domination for its own sake, and just about retaining the illusion of the impossibility of freedom for human beings, i.e., people being autonomous and working less, and determining their own needs and satisfactions. I hope that some fairly strong links can be seen between this and some of the things we talked about last time, in terms of a post-work society as being central to post-capitalism. As I said, this is my pitch of considering Marcuse as something of an accelerationist. Isn't the final phrase about pursuing alienation right through? The elimination of human potentialities from the world of alienated labour creates the preconditions for the elimination of labour from the world of human potentialities. A typical Frankfurt School reversal. Okay, so this is 1954. These ideas circulate, not necessarily directly from Marcuse, but they're around. And the conditions of the 1960s, then, which are precisely where, in large parts of the Western world, scarcity is substantially reduced, certainly for members of what you might call the bohemian class, a newly emergent bohemian class. They don't have to work as much. There are periods, particularly in their youth, when they're free of work for substantial periods, and they start to be inspired by this notion that you can both work less and determine your own needs and satisfactions. And this is the basis of the so-called counterculture of the 1960s, in which Ellen Willis was involved. So perhaps now we can turn to student number 7 to say a few words about what we think is at stake in Ellen Willis's text. I guess there's a kind of reverse narrative in place here, by putting Willis's text first in the course reader, which was also not contemporaneous with the counterculture but came afterwards. She wrote in the late 70s, I think 79, a very significant year. She's already trying to explain what went wrong and why it didn't really work. But I think there's some kind of resonance between her and Marcuse. Student number 7. Yeah, I think, as you just touched upon, she does point towards how, after World War II, the 50s and 60s, that was more of a golden era in terms of feminism, especially radical feminism, than the 1970s, which is when she's talking about what she's lived through as a result of conservatism within society and austerity measures. There's this resurgence of traditional family values, and that directly implicates radical feminists and the counterculture, because they feel as though there is this interdependency between capitalism and traditional family values. The counterculture are anti-capitalist, and they feel as though society is regressing again. And I find it quite interesting throughout the text how there are these constant contradictions and obstacles that she faces personally, and that feminism as a sort of totality faces. So her desire to get married, which she has once had, and which she once again has, leads to this internal struggle over the morality of marriage, because being married is buying into this need to be within a patriarchal family society, which is not good for a feminist in the 70s. And she also discusses people who were involved in their protests, like men who considered themselves to be feminist, but only wanted to liberate women to a certain extent. They wanted them to be liberated, but still wanted wives. Or, as you were touching upon just then, this bohemian class. She was quite critical of them, because a lot of bohemians were from middle-class backgrounds. They never felt the struggles that other people in their situation would have done. I feel like she has also given up in the text. She wants to pursue her ambitions also on a selfish level, of seeing her feminist ideas follow through and get past this patriarchal society. But I feel like there's a sense that it is impossible to be unbound from a capitalist society, in her opinion. MF. Okay, I think that's partly why I like it. It registers the historical meaning of the end of the 1970s. But what I also like about it, Ellen Willis, by the way, for people who don't know, she was a culture critic and a music writer. She was involved right in the heart of the counterculture itself. But I think she really overturns a lot of the stereotypes about what the counterculture was and what its unachieved ambitions were. Why do we still care about the 1960s? Why are we required to care about the 1960s? Why does it haunt us at the level of iconography, and why do its cultural forms persist? I'd say it has something to do with the unrealized desires that were inherent in those forms. I don't like this phrase speak to, that they're still relevant to. What comes across from this? I think you're right, she sort of has given up. But she's honest about that. She's saying that this was a part of a general mood, which it was by the time of the 1970s. So, between Marcuse's text and Ellen Willis's text is this attempt to break out, which fails, which does fail. And I think her text is important because she identifies some of the reasons that it failed. But let's go back to what it actually wanted then. What the counterculture aimed at was the phrase that I picked up, a social and psychic revolution of almost inconceivable magnitude. We who came after the 1960s, even though I was born in the 1960s, although too late to comprehend it at that time, we who come after it find it hard to imagine a time when those ambitions seem to be realistic. What's being registered in this text by this time is the simultaneous and synchronized emergence of capitalist realism and domestic realism, and their co-implication. The idea that there's no alternative to capitalism, and there's no alternative to the family either. I actually think that domestic realism is even more powerful than capitalist realism in today's world. Even when I was at school in the 1980s, there were fairly serious debates about alternatives to the family. I remember when I taught teenagers a few years ago, you'd talk about alternatives to the family, and they were just horrified by the very thought of it. And the full tragedy of that was, of course, that many of them had come from very difficult family backgrounds. So they had an idealized idea of the family that didn't fit with their experience of the family at all. And yet that very idealization implied that they still held up the family as an idea. The countercultural mission to have done with the family really has almost entirely disappeared now as a widespread cultural phenomenon. I don't distinguish, in a Kantian sense, between the family as a transcendental structure and a family as an empirical fact. The family as an empirical fact is under massive pressure. As I understand it, particularly in the UK, I don't know what the figures are worldwide, but there are more people living on their own than ever before. Of course, divorce has increased beyond all proportion since the 1970s. So the family is not empirically strong, I would say. It's empirically weak, but it is transcendentally strong. It's strong as a sort of basic structure that is still normative. Now, if you think of people living collectively, you think of that as a temporary phase, when actually there is more of that than there was in the 1970s, all because people can't afford to live on their own, particularly in London. So, there's increasing amounts of people living outside the family structure, and yet the family remains normative, I would suggest. You could also note that there are also increasing options for women, but none of those options are allowed. None of those options are socially permissible, at least as far as still dominant right-wing narratives go. If you have a child, and stay at home to look after that child, then you're a slacker who should be working. If you don't have a child, then you're free. You're denying nature. Everyone wants a child, don't they? We know all women do, really. These things ought to be completely archaic now. But they're not, are they? And this kind of double bind, which means you've got two contradictory commands at any one time, is key to contemporary forms of subjugation and the continued subjugation of women. Women's magazines are full of these two contradictory commands at any one time. Love your body, be who you want to be, here's a diet. Laughter. This is a long way from what people thought was realistic. People thought it was realistic. This is what Willis is pointing to. It was realistic. We'll get rid of the family and we'll do it now. We'll do it now. We'll start living in communes and that'll be it. That's the end of it. But obviously that was ridiculous. But it didn't seem ridiculous at the time. And that's the value of the text, to bring those two things together. By the end of the 1970s, the Promethean ambition that this could be undone, that has disappeared by then, together with this vivid conviction that it could be done. So, she says there are a number of things that point to why it failed. What were they? What were the main reasons? Student number 8. Is one of the things to do with that idea of how marriage, as an institution, represses desire because you're going against the idea of instinctive action in going into some sort of agreement that is long-term and sets up a sort of construct that won't allow, traditionally, for you to follow your desire as it changes? MF. Yeah, that's part of it. She's suggesting that there's just an inherent conflict between love relations that shift over time and the permanency of the institution of marriage. And in Nick Cernek and Alex Williams' text, they point this out. The more that women have economic independence, the more the idea of something like universal basic income will be respected. There's this yoking of an erotic and emotional set of desires with institutional elements. But why wouldn't that work against marriage? Why wouldn't that work towards living communally? That's a problem. That's why marriages are bad. Therefore, let's all go live in communes instead. Has anyone lived in a commune? No response. Even 20 years ago, I reckon there would probably be some people in this room who would have tried it. It points us towards the privatization of money, doesn't it? The idea seems to make sense that you share money with your family, but sharing money with people who aren't your family on a permanent basis, also collective child-rearing. I know Big Flame, who were a kind of libertarian communist group in the 1970s, did this. They experimented with collective child-rearing. And I think of course it would work. It's got to work better, doesn't it? It's got to work better than child-rearing within the context of the so-called nuclear family. You could say the nuclear family has been in crisis since the moment it emerged. Because the nuclear family is new, historically very new, although it assumes like this quasi-transcendental normativity. Mummy, daddy, me. This is clearly the basis of Freud's model, but of course it wasn't mummy, daddy, me in Freud's day. It was probably mummy, daddy, nanny, me. Because extended families were the norm throughout much of history, and only recently, under pressure of capitalism, did the nuclear family emerge. You shouldn't be nostalgic for the extended family. There's lots of problems with it. But you can be nostalgic about certain aspects of it by comparison to the nuclear family. It's just by odds, isn't it? If you have a bigger group of people involved in child-rearing, the odds of it going badly wrong, or of very specific neuroses being passed on, are surely much less. But the reality of these communes, certainly as they developed in the 1960s, have people seen that Adam Curtis series? Some of you will have seen it, the Machines of Love and Grace thing, where he mocks the commune thing quite heavily. It's probably justified as well. For me, the key thing that she points to is impatience. Impatience, material privilege, and age, which is another form of privilege in a sense, although not so much now. Impatience, first of all. They thought they could get rid of this straight away. That's crazy. Things that, she said, had lasted thousands of years, and we'll get rid of them in a generation, no problem. How do we do it? We'll just go live in a house together and work it out. But they just didn't have the persistence that families did. They didn't find a way of making this stick over time. So even relatively successful communes only lasted a few years. To think that people hate their own families, it's just not that common. Even if that is the case, nevertheless, they still retain some identification with them, probably for the rest of their lives. It shows the power of a deeply embedded family structure, and so I think what she's pointing to is the tenacity of those structures, which aren't just susceptible to voluntaristically being overcome. And she said they meet real needs. The family meets real needs. They might meet them badly, because the time of Willis is also the time in which the family is under attack from people like R.D. Laing, David Cooper, saying it's the source of mental illness. It's a kind of neurosis and psychosis factory, the family. People weren't saying that so much by the time she wrote this, though, but certainly in the 1960s that was certainly around. So, impatience, that's the first thing. Impatience. Structures of this tenacity, this length of time, and which are clearly fulfilling some need and, even if they're not, still command a certain level of attachment from that sheer, gross persistence. They are difficult to overcome, if not impossible to overcome entirely. The second thing she's saying is youth. A lot of people involved in communes were young. They could afford to have these sorts of experiments for a while, but as they got older, they retreated back into the standard structures of Western society. The other thing she says is wealth and privilege. Most people didn't have the capacity to drop out. This was obviously key to it, as she points out, and as we see in Marcuse. Relative prosperity is key. The relative prosperity of the US at that time. But that prosperity was not evenly distributed, and those who dropped out tended to be those who could afford to do so because, at some level, I'm not saying they were insincere and thought, yeah, I can drop out for a while, but in a few years I'll be able to drop back in when I have more of a capacity to do so. Nevertheless, they didn't have that base level of anxieties about the risks of leaving behind conservative structures. This leaves us with a fairly bleak picture, but that's not really what I wanted from this. Laughs. So what if we reframe what was happening in the 1960s not as some golden era where everything was great and then all went wrong? Willis's analysis gives us some of the resources to think of this as a stalled project. If impatience was a problem, then patience is needed. So how do we develop patience? How do we develop patience sufficient to overcome these very deep and very long-lasting structures? How do we spread out the accessibility of these kinds of experiments of alternative living from particular groups, from youth and from the relatively privileged? And to return to Marcuse, isn't it the case that there's more real scarcity now than there was in the 1960s? Real is a problematic term. What are the actual limits? That's a big question. What are the actual necessities now that put limits on human freedom? You won't get a bigger question than that today, promise. Student number 9. Shelter, food, resources. And I guess the climate is becoming one. MF. Yeah, this is a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, isn't it? But surely emotional needs must count as equally significant. If all those needs are met, but there's no care for each other. Student number 8. One of the quotes that I thought was really interesting was on page 161, where she says, The difference has to do with home being the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. And also being something you don't deserve. I have friends who would take me in, but on some level I think I have to deserve them. And that idea of the family being this unit that reinstates that individualism versus a community where you all equally rely on each other and you earn it. MF. Yeah, but is community the right term for it? I have a lot of problems with the term community, largely because of the way it's been easily appropriated by the right, but also because it implies an in and an out. Some are in the community and some are out of it. I had a slogan once, care without community. Isn't that what we want? Where you can give people the care regardless